There are a few things in this life that are truly inevitable. But amongst all the chaos and unpredictability that surrounds us every day, there is one thing you can always rely on: the unstoppable production of sequels. It doesn't matter if we're talking about movies, books, TV shows, or music. When a piece of media proves that it can make money, you are virtually guaranteed to get another. And in the world of video games, where legacy series and recognizable faces dominate sales charts, this addiction is particularly powerful. There's just something about seeing a number next to a familiar title that gets people hot under the collar. And given just how many of the most historically acclaimed games are themselves sequels, you can't blame fans for trusting that the inescapable next entry will fix all of their complaints and refine everything they loved. After all, it's basic human nature. We love what we know and we're unsure about what we don't, which means that much to the joy of all the money men and marketeers, selling you a sequel is usually a pretty straightforward strategy. This is exactly why Half-Life 2 is so utterly perplexing. Because unlike your Resident Evils, your Zeldas, your Final Fantasies and Call of Duties, this is a sequel and a series that was and is anything but inevitable. Now, I'm sure you'll have already heard the story told like this. Half-Life 1 was a huge success, so Valve spent half a decade making a hyper-advanced follow-up, which was itself a big financial and critical hit. And then, after producing a couple of ambitious episodic expansions, they abandoned the series on a brutal cliffhanger, because Steam was producing a river of gold. Well, today we're going to investigate just how accurate this version of events truly is. Because in reality, I think Half-Life 2 is a much more complicated sequel than people often make out, and represents a very turbulent period in the history of Valve and the wider industry. Yes, it is an inspired combination of technical brilliance, captivating world building, and timeless shooter gameplay, but it also nearly destroyed its creator multiple times over, and that legendary, unfinished ending, well, I think it masks some uncomfortable truths that don't often see the light of day. This is the story of the most famous sequel in video game history, Half-Life 2, the twisting tale of a hero coming back to save humanity from enslavement, and a studio desperately trying to make lightning strike twice. Now, as always, before we board the train to City 17, I want to take a brief moment to remind you that I Finished a Video Game is only alive and kicking thanks to the support of its patrons. I'm sure you've noticed that YouTube in 2026 is a pretty wild place, as Google have decided that vertical slop and AI nonsense are far more important than high-effort, long-form work. So, if you want to keep seeing video game history presented in all of its lengthy and detailed glory, Patreon is the very best way. It's currently 50% off to celebrate the release of a new video, which means that for less than the price of a large coffee, you can keep this channel firing and gain access to a bunch of exclusive Patreon videos. If you do want to give it a shot, the link and the code for the discount are down in the description below. So to everyone who decides to sign up, thank you from the bottom of my heart. So, with the formalities out of the way, let's strap on that old HEV suit and dive headfirst into a sea of alien monsters, heroic freedom fighters, crazed developers, and a series unlike any other. Given that this video is itself a sequel, I think we'd better start off with a little recap and remind ourselves of how Valve ended up working on one of the most anticipated sequels of all time. The story begins back in 1996, when they were nothing more than a small group of engineers, designers, and artists, all working out of an office in Kirkland, Washington. They had been set up by Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington, a couple of ex-Microsoft employees who had left very well-paying jobs in order to chase the coming video game boom. And despite them having zero experience of managing a studio, in November of 1998, Valve put out their very first game. This was an ambitious and groundbreaking project, a first-person shooter that emphasized immersion and atmosphere over constant action, but still managed to deliver the pulse-pounding thrills and jaw-dropping visuals that you'd expect from a blockbuster release. It was full of unique ideas, like its unbroken first-person perspective, the way its levels seamlessly flowed into one another, its realistic NPCs and its interactive world, all of which told the story of a young scientist called Gordon Freeman trying to escape the alien-infested halls of Black Mesa. This was, of course, Half-Life, and it was a huge success, raking in critical acclaim from every corner of the industry and shipping 8 million units in just a handful of years. An incredible achievement considering its publisher had pulled funding after Newell asked for a year-long extension. Anyway, given these numbers, a sequel was inevitable, but the story of its development is so messy and so chaotic, so fraught with obstacles that would have killed any other game, that frankly, it is a miracle that another Half-Life game ever saw the light of day. Now, much of this turmoil started within the studio itself, as soon after the release of Half-Life 1, Valve's leadership underwent a pretty big change, as in June of 2000, Mike Harrington sold his share in the company. This meant that Gabe Newell was now in charge of Valve entirely on his own, and while this didn't really impact the day-to-day running of the studio, it did have big consequences for the company's philosophy. You see, Harrington was a businessman and a realist, concerned with producing products that Valve could actually sell, while Newell was more of a dreamer, a man who wanted to push technological and artistic boundaries and was far less concerned with nickels and dimes. Without Harrington to keep everything in check, the next phase of Valve's history began with ludicrously lofty objectives, as Newell called the team together and told them that not only would they be producing their own cutting-edge game engine, but that alongside this, their much-anticipated Half-Life sequel needed to be the greatest first-person shooter in video game history. It was complete hubris after a single hit, but to be fair to Newell, he put his money where his mouth was, and also told the team that they would have unlimited funding and as much time as they needed. They just had to make sure that their next game was nothing less than spectacular. Now, as if that wasn't already quite a lot of work, Valve also began putting together a program that would allow players to update and buy games from across the internet, all without the need for physical discs or stores. It was a very strange idea that had people questioning its potential, but ever the visionary, Newell was convinced that this was the future of the industry. And so they ploughed ahead, attempting to break boundaries in 3 different directions, all at the same time. Given that Valve only employed 30 people, this all probably sounds like a recipe for disaster. But amazingly, Valve staff were totally on board and enthusiastically dived into the work, hiring in lots of new colleagues and slowly starting to form what would become the Source Engine, Steam, and Half-Life 2. Now, there's a lot to unpick from these years, but I want to start by focusing on a particular new face. A brilliant artist who joined Valve a few months into this process and would end up having a massive impact on the direction of Half-Life 2. This was Viktor Antonov, a deeply creative man who had worked in all manner of strange industries, like designing futuristic concept cars or directing TV adverts. But he found his true calling in video games after joining a small LA developer called Xatrix Entertainment. Here he had fallen in love with the idea of designing video game levels as if they were realistic environments, something that he poetically described as a privilege normally reserved for kings and dictators. At this time, his masterpiece was a game called Kingpin: Life of Crime, a moderately popular 1998 first-person shooter that took place in a sprawling Art Deco city, full of film noir-inspired bars and steampunk gangster hideouts, all of which gave the game a really unique aesthetic and won Antonov a job at Valve. Now, at first, the idea had been for him to produce concept art that would help the designers and writers flesh out their ideas. But over time, his work began to influence them to such a strong degree that he was promoted to art director and given free rein over the look of Valve's big sequel. This is quite notable because, if you can believe it, Half-Life 2's now iconic art, its grounded and gritty mixture of Soviet architecture, wild countryside and sleek alien technology, well, this only came together after Antonov took over, as the game began life with a much darker tone and far more traditional sci-fi ideas. Originally, its lead writer, Mark Laidlaw, who had been a key part of the Half-Life 1 team, had come up with a sort of combination of Blade Runner and 1984, a neo-noir, totalitarian cyberpunk world caked in grime and darkness, caused by the conquest of Earth by a terrible alien empire. Early concept art and story treatments were full of Dune-inspired assassins and aristocrats, crumbling slums full of downtrodden human slaves, towering installations that poisoned the air and drained water from the oceans, all of which painted a dystopian vision of the world outside of Black Mesa. Now, this would have likely become the Half-Life 2 that we all know today, were it not for the intervention of two key men, both of whom had very different ideas about where this sequel should be headed. The first was the aforementioned Viktor Antonov, who was far less interested in creating a fantastical sci-fi dystopia and instead wanted to focus on a more relatable kind of human horror. You see, Antonov had grown up in communist Bulgaria, so to him, totalitarianism wasn't just a state police and constant propaganda, but something more insidiously mundane. In interviews, he often said that he found a juxtaposition between beauty and ugliness far more disturbing than typical shocking horror, and wanted to make something influenced by Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, an epic historical movie about the life of a deeply unlikable swindler that takes place against a lavish and colourful backdrop. This caused Half-Life 2's art direction and premise to dramatically shift, and as the cyberpunk visuals were stripped out, it slowly morphed into its iconic grounded look, a game where alien monsters stalk realistic coastline and brutalist cityscapes tower over paramilitary violence. Now, along with Antonov's new visuals, Half-Life 2's story and structure also underwent big changes, and this was largely because of Gabe Newell, who constantly pushed the team to streamline their narrative ideas and focus on gameplay innovation over complex storytelling. For example, in early 2002, there was a moment where the team felt that they might be ready for E3, but when they sat down to show Newell their work, he told them that not only would they not be taking it to the conference, but that they needed to start over from scratch. He felt that they had produced something far too focused on expository dialogue and detailed world building, a demo that was full of narrative and character but had very little of the eye-catching technology and fresh ideas that he wanted from a sequel. As he was the boss, work had to start over, this time trying to focus on the game rather than the world, and unsurprisingly, this badly damaged the team's morale, as some of them had already been working on the project for 3 years, and it felt as if the end was nowhere in sight. So this gloomy atmosphere inside of Valve brings us onto the first major crisis in the development of Half-Life 2. By early 2003, the Source engine was just about finished, and this meant that work could really ramp up, which prompted Newell to push ahead with a truly ridiculous idea. For some reason, he decided that they would not only reveal their game to the public at E3 of that year, but that they would also announce its release date, September 30th, just 4 months later. A double whammy that he hoped would supercharge fan excitement and galvanise his studio to work even harder. Now, this wasn't an opinion shared by many of the already exhausted dev team, but when they arrived at E3 in May of 2003, it looked as if Gabe might have made the right call. Half-Life 2 was the talk of the conference, and at the Valve booth, huge lines formed as people desperately tried to catch a glimpse of a lengthy demo, which showed off technology that looked generations ahead of the competition. In recordings, you can literally hear the audience gasping as they saw faces that could present hundreds of different expressions, a physics engine that gave every in-game item reactive and interactive properties, shaders that could imitate shimmering above flames or real-time reflections, and then even more impressively, all of this being used in fluid first-person gameplay. It was incredible stuff by the standards of 2003, so when Newell announced that everyone would get their hands on it in a matter of weeks rather than years, the conference exploded with excitement, and Half-Life 2 seemed destined to be another monster hit. For a brief moment, it looked as if Newell's crazy plan had paid off, but very quickly, these decisions came back to haunt him with almighty consequences. The burning issue was that outside of the E3 tech demos, Half-Life 2 was still very far from being finished, and in reality, even with all hands on deck, crunching like they had never crunched before, there was absolutely no way that the game could be finished in 2003, let alone by September. Everyone except Newell seemed to understand this, but for some reason he had become convinced that it was still possible, and it led to extremely awkward meetings, like one where he insisted that they should start work on non-English localizations, only to discover that the writing team hadn't even finished the script. After months of self-delusion, where websites and magazines were repeatedly told that everything was on track, reality finally set in, and Newell agreed that they had to delay the game. But even then, he left things way too late, only announcing this on September 23rd, a week before it was due to come out. This was another major miscalculation, as the industry in the early 2000s was very different to how it is today, as high-profile game delays were virtually unheard of, and it led to a tidal wave of conspiracy theories about Valve faking E3 footage and trying to steal their fans' pre-order money. Between negative coverage in magazines and endless angry posts on fan forums, it quickly spiraled into a serious PR disaster. But for as disappointed as the fans were, the situation was even worse for Valve's business partners, many of whom had signed big money advertising deals that couldn't be moved, or had bought in hardware specifically to sell alongside Half-Life 2. The most legendary of these blow-ups was a lavish $6 million launch party on Alcatraz Island, put together by the graphics card company ATI, who still had to go ahead with the event despite them having no game to celebrate, much to the confusion of all the journalists and executives who had been invited. Gabe would later describe the whole episode as totally embarrassing and humiliating, a terrible mistake that had made Valve look like they were either incompetent or liars. Now, despite the chaos happening on the outside, the delay was warmly greeted inside of Valve's walls, as the development team were deathly afraid that the September release date would mean that they had to cut anything that was unfinished and release a game that didn't reflect their ambitions. With the date now pushed back, they could take the time to make sure that Half-Life 2 was the sequel they had wanted to make. But unfortunately, this ended up taking quite a lot more time, a staggering 14 months. For any other game in any other studio, this would have been a catastrophic development cycle. But if you can believe it, we are nowhere near finished with Valve's Half-Life 2 nightmare. As even after the delay crisis was resolved, even greater thunderstorms were lurking on the horizon.
Warning, vital signs critical.
Late in 2003, while browsing a popular Valve fan site, Half-Life 2 level designer Dave Riller discovered that an internal email he had sent Gabe Newell, talking about how much they loved Doom 3, had somehow got out into the wild. It was a baffling thing to see, so Dave went to ask his boss if he had forwarded the message on to anyone outside of the company, but Gabe was adamant that he hadn't. Very quickly the two realised what had happened, and as Newell combed through his PC, he found hidden hard drive partitions, weird software that he hadn't installed, and some very strange spikes on Valve's internal network. The company's servers were immediately disconnected from the internet, but it was already too late. Valve had been hacked, and they had no idea what had been stolen. Well, a few days later, the whole world got to find out, as on October 4th, 2003, the entire Half-Life 2 source code was leaked online. And then to make matters even worse, a few days later, a playable build was compiled and made available to anyone who could download it. For the team at Valve, this was a disaster that went far beyond the delay, because this ambitious undertaking that they had spent years pouring their hearts and souls into was now being picked apart in a state that was nowhere near representative of what would eventually release. It was a buggy, unpolished, half-baked imitation of Half-Life 2, and to have this be the world's first taste of the game, well, it caused morale to to crash through the floor, and apparently even led to talks about abandoning the project altogether. Gabe desperately tried to reassure his team, but it was a very tough situation, as the delay had already meant that Half-Life 2's costs had spiraled to over $1 million a month, and now there was a genuine fear that the leak would destroy any hope of eventually turning a profit. It was as low as the team ever got, but through sheer faith in their work and amazing camaraderie, they found the strength to push on, regardless of all the online chatter about broken builds and missed release dates. Now, in a rare moment of good fortune, the mystery of how Half-Life 2 was hacked ended up solving itself in an extremely unlikely way. If you can believe it, in February of 2004, Gabe Newell received an email from a young German kid called Axel, who told him that he was a huge fan of Valve's work, and that last year he had hacked into their network to see if he could find any information about the sequel. Apparently, Axel had only intended to sit and watch the team working, but the longer he went undetected, the more confident he became, and after a few months of quiet spying, he shared some of his findings with his online friends, who promptly leaked everything. The reason for his email was to apologise, as Axel had read reports about how much upset he had caused his favourite studio, and so he decided to reach out and let them know that he hadn't really meant any harm. It was a well-intentioned, albeit naive message, but this didn't do much to make Gabe Newell feel better, and in a move of sheer Machiavellian vengeance, he told Axel that he was so impressed with his skills he wanted to hire him as a security consultant, a position that he would have to accept in person at Valve's offices. It sounds like something out of a movie, except that in reality, Gabe had also contacted the FBI, who would be waiting for Axel as soon as he landed in the United States, ready to charge him with multiple counts of corporate theft. Amazingly, Axel only avoided a very long jail sentence thanks to the interference of the German government, who weren't at all comfortable with an American company entrapping a German citizen. So they arrested him before he could leave and charged him on home soil, where he got away with 2 years probation thanks to a particularly kind judge. Now, if you can believe it, this second disaster still doesn't take us to the release of Half-Life 2, as while all of this was happening, the shifts in direction and the E3 presentations and the delays and the leaks, there was yet another catastrophe constantly battering Valve's ramparts. In order to understand this one, we have to rewind back to the production of Half-Life 1, as it had been published by Sierra, a company that only agreed to put up any money if Valve signed over the rights to the series, and then had pulled funding when the game needed a delay. This had meant that Newell and Harrington had to use their own money to get Half-Life finished, which obviously strained the relationship between the two companies, a situation that only got worse when Sierra began publishing Half-Life expansions without the involvement of Valve. Fortunately, our Seattle developers managed to reclaim sole ownership of the Half-Life series thanks to some clever contractual maneuvers by Monica Harrington, but during the development of Half-Life 2, the Valve-Sierra connection went into full meltdown. Now, there has never been any official confirmation, but the theory goes that Vivendi, who were Sierra's parent company, were extremely annoyed that they had lost control of one of their most lucrative series, so they began to squeeze what remained of the publishing rights for all it was worth. In August of 2002, it emerged that they had started selling copies of Half-Life into the Asian internet cafe market, a very profitable business thanks to the popularity of Counter-Strike, but one that Valve had expressly stated was not part of their publishing deal. So Newell filed a lawsuit, and had expected it to be resolved without any real issue, but on this, he was extremely wrong. Turns out, Vivendi were looking for an excuse to fight, and in response, they filed a massive countersuit that accused Valve of purposefully delaying Half-Life 2 in order to defraud them, and developing Steam as a way to sabotage the game's physical release. In recompense, they wanted Steam to be scrapped, the rights to develop their own games on the Source engine, and full control of the Half-Life IP. A crazy set of demands that Valve obviously rejected outright. What followed was a brutal court battle, where Vivendi named Valve employees and their families as defendants, rather than the company, and drowned them in hundreds of thousands of legal documents, all designed to force a settlement or bleed them dry, whichever came first. Gabe had to hire 6 full-time lawyers in order to deal with all of Vivendi's legal tricks, which cost a huge amount of money and frequently took key team members away from their jobs for depositions and statements. Even more so than the delay and the leak, this court case created a huge shadow over every moment of Half-Life 2's development, as there was genuine fear that Vivendi would somehow be able to block the game from releasing, or that they would refuse to publish the physical copy until the case was settled. Now, we're jumping ahead a little, but in early 2005, Vivendi's lawsuit was eventually thrown out, thanks to a ludicrous stroke of luck on the part of Valve. You see, part of the publisher's strategy was to flood Valve's lawyers with thousands of emails between various Korean partners of Vivendi, none of which were provided with translations, a move designed to do nothing more than waste their time. The only problem with this was that one of Valve's legal assistants spoke fluent Korean, which meant that they were able to sort through the emails extremely efficiently. And while going through yet another batch that initially appeared to be corporate nonsense, they stumbled across a smoking gun. Without realizing it, Vivendi had sent Valve an email where one of their Korean employees confirmed that they had destroyed evidence that was directly related to the lawsuit, and that the order to do this had come from the company's American head office. This was an unbelievable blunder, and when it was presented to the presiding judge, he immediately ordered that Vivendi's testimony be considered completely unreliable, which led to their countersuit being thrown out, a ruling in Valve's favour in the first suit, and the awarding of full damages for the second. It was a huge victory, and obviously signalled the end of these two companies' business relationship. But the more observant among you will have noticed that this meant that the Vivendi lawsuit was resolved after Half-Life 2 came out. In a strange twist, Vivendi did actually honour their publishing agreement, and put out the physical version of Half-Life 2 when it was eventually finished in 2004, even going as far as to publicly congratulate the team at Valve, a move that is as insulting as it is confusing. Anyway, the point of all this is that Half-Life 2's development was about as chaotic and messy as a video game production can ever be, but somehow, despite everything we've just discussed, a full and finished game did eventually release, on November 16th, 2004. Now, if this were any other studio, you would expect chaos on this scale to have produced a real mess. But Valve were not any other studio, and quite literally, against all of the odds, Half-Life 2 was received like manna from heaven. It was lavished with astounding critical acclaim, receiving perfect or near-perfect scores from virtually every outlet that covered it. And as of today, it is the 16th highest rated game of all time, according to Metacritic, boasting a towering average of 96 out of 100. Dan Adams at IGN called it the best single-player shooter ever made. Andrew Pfister of 1UP labelled it a revolution in game design. Edge magazine here in the UK awarded it only their 10th perfect score ever, calling it a breathtaking paragon of the medium. Essentially, Half-Life 2 wasn't just seen as a good sequel that had taken a long time to come out, but one of the best video games ever made. And as the dust settled, these gushing reviews translated into a tidal wave of awards, as Valve scooped up 39 different Game of the Year wins. So clearly, those 6 years of near constant pain must have been more than worth it. And if we include the game's lofty enduring legacy, where it still sells tens of thousands of copies every year and inspires a burning need amongst fans for a proper sequel, it would surely be madness to describe Half-Life 2 as anything other than a monster success. And yet, maybe that is not quite the case. You see, I am not entirely convinced that the Half-Life 2 of today is the same as the Half-Life 2 of the mid-2000s. As thanks to quite a bit of historical revisionism, there are aspects of this story that have been long since drowned out amidst all of the gushing praise. The accuracy of those review scores, the truth behind its sales numbers, the real reason that it never received a sequel. No, there is a lot more uncertainty in the Half-Life 2 story than you might have previously realised, and in the rest of this video, I'm going to lay out a very different argument to the one you might have heard 1,000 times already. But before we get to that, we need to establish what exactly Half-Life 2 is, and try to unpick not only why it is held in such lofty regard, but just why it was so damn hard to make. Let's begin with an observation that is always taken for granted when talking about Half-Life 2, that this is a very strange sequel, one that takes the series off in a direction that few would have predicted back in 1998. Now this is largely thanks to Half-Life 1's iconic cliffhanger ending, where Gordon Freeman defeats the invading alien forces in their homeworld of Zen, and then is whisked away by the mysterious G-Man, who claims that his services are being retained for an unspecified future mission. It was a finale that left fans desperate to know more about this strange character and its motivations. But at the risk of jumping ahead in the story, Half-Life 2 does not really provide any clear answers. Instead, it's much more of a standalone story, loosely connected to the previous game through a handful of characters and vague references, but otherwise concerned with an entirely different narrative, one built upon lots of new world building and a much more cinematic style, all of which needs to be set up in the game's opening hour. So we begin with the reptilian tones of the G-Man, telling Dr. Freeman that he must wake up and smell the ashes, a line that is as cryptic as it is iconic, and which sets the tone for everything to come. With this, Gordon opens his eyes and reality pulls into focus, and he finds himself aboard a rundown train, pulling into an equally rundown city, where it becomes immediately clear that he has been gone for some time. These opening moments, where we disembark and wander through the station's security checkpoints, are all about this change in setting, as just like in Half-Life 1, the game starts with a fairly lengthy sequence of non-combat, where you're encouraged to wander through this new environment, soaking in the dystopian atmosphere and observing all sorts of little dioramas that clue you in on what is happening. Evidently, the world as Dr. Freeman knew it has been swept away, as humanity now exists as a slave race, ruled over by alien conquerors known as the Combine, who have made their capital in the nameless sprawl of City 17, the location where Gordon now finds himself. Here they impose brutal totalitarian rule through the use of advanced technology and a masked police force called the Overwatch, who we see bullying and abusing downtrodden citizens, all clad in dirty identical overalls and all quietly simmering with frustration and fear. It is a real contrast to Half-Life 1, which had an almost humorous tone in its early moments, and as we uncover more details about this setup, we're confronted with some very intense imagery. We see travel documents being invalidated, private rooms for interrogation and torture, families tensely waiting for passengers who will never arrive, roads blocked off to those without proper paperwork, citizens being arrested in what look like public executions, all while security drones endlessly scan for dissidents and propaganda blasts out from speakers and screens. Considering Half-Life 2 was made in the early 2000s, a time when space marines, magical knights and heroic ninjas were still all the rage, this is disturbingly realistic subject matter for a mainstream video game, which is exactly what Viktor Antonov was trying to achieve, a kind of grounded horror that contrasts with the game's technical beauty. Now this brings me on to another interesting point about our antagonists, because while the Combine are set up as an invading outside force, their influence on Half-Life 2's gameplay and narrative comes in a very human-looking package. Rather than the endless parade of strange aliens we saw in the previous game, the forces of the Combine are staffed by native collaborators, dressed in paramilitary-style uniforms with striking white masks. Along with this, the repression isn't orchestrated by some twisted alien overlord, but by a human administrator called Dr. Wallace Breen, a figure who appears constantly throughout the game and provides Orwellian-style public addresses that all try to justify the horrible things being done to humanity. This gives us a figure to focus our rage onto, a villain that Gordon will obviously come face to face with, but by making him, and by extension the soldiers serving him, human, the world of Half-Life 2 is made so much richer than a bog-standard good versus evil, humans versus aliens sci-fi war story. There must be differing opinions about how the Combine should be dealt with, and some bribe or benefit to working for them. Maybe warring political factions amongst the repressed humans, and of course some sort of unseen history that led to Dr. Breen being placed in charge. By implying all of this, rather than telling us directly, you get something that pricks at your imagination without breaking immersion, which in many ways is more enjoyable than a fully fleshed out backstory, and is a kind of storytelling that works perfectly in this slow-paced, exploratory style opening. Now, on top of setting up the state of the world and introducing our villains, Half-Life 2's opening sequence also serves another purpose, which is to establish the game's unique narrative style and introduce a few of Valve's new ideas. If you remember, Half-Life 1's big innovation was its refusal to use cutscenes, and how control of Gordon Freeman was never taken away from the player. A move that meant you could ignore the entire story, but ironically led to a much more immersive experience if you did pay attention. The goal of Half-Life 2 was to take this foundation and add in a lot more cinematic flair, replacing the unmoving talking heads and non-interactive performances with moments of believable drama and characters that you might actually come to care about. We get our first taste of this in the City 17 train station, where Gordon is stopped at a checkpoint and ushered into a private room, which is clearly used for interrogation and torture. Thankfully, our captor turns out to be a familiar face, Barney Calhoun, the security guard from Sector C in Half-Life 1, now working undercover for the Human Resistance, and who, after getting in touch with another Black Mesa veteran, Dr. Kleiner, helps us to escape from the station. In total, it only lasts a couple of minutes, but this scene highlights how much more fluid Half-Life 2's narrative moments will be, as we're not just standing still and listening to exposition from cut and paste NPCs, but watching characters that feel human. They move around while talking and use expressive animations. They interact with objects and each other during dialogue. They look and sound much more realistic, and to be frank, the whole package is just a massive evolution from the immersive, but also quite plain storytelling in Half-Life 1. Now, it's a bit of a tangent, but something I've always loved about Half-Life 2 is how the game's iconic cast of characters were formed out of this crazy mixture of random experimentation and thoughtful design. One of the game's flagship technical achievements was its groundbreaking facial animations, which could handle proper lip syncing, independently moving eyes, and hundreds of different emotional expressions. This had taken developer Ken Birdwell almost 3 years to perfect, and had required this enormous process of studying the work of facial psychologist Paul Ackman, who created categories of expression, which Birdwell then converted into a form that could work with all the game's characters. It was an incredibly impressive piece of engineering, but this came paired with the most random method of creating character models. Rather than the cast being designed by Victor Antonov and his artists, or Mark Laidlaw and the writers, or even being based on images of their voice actors, Valve instead encouraged the team to take pictures of random people if they felt they looked the part. Barney Calhoun is based on a photo of Valve COO Scott Lynch. Dr. Kleiner was born after one of the team bumped into an accountant in their building's elevator. And amazingly, Eli Vance, a very important character that we are yet to meet, was modelled on a homeless man who hung out beneath a nearby bridge. It's an approach that you just can't imagine any modern studio pursuing, but it's exactly what makes this era of video game development so endearing. NPC expressions that took a genius developer years to create, pasted onto an image of one of the team's karate teachers. Anyway, returning to Half-Life 2's opening moments, the new cinematic style is rounded out with the addition of more heavily scripted story sequences, which are clearly an attempt to take the exciting experiment from the opening of Half-Life 1 and have things like this happen more often. Throughout Half-Life 2, we get all these little moments of interactivity that advance the plot without having to rely on dialogue or exposition, and there is a great example of just how effective these can be right as we start our hunt for Dr. Kleiner. The search takes us through the streets of City 17 and into a dilapidated apartment block, full of half-starved residents, crumbling walls, and broken furniture. A sorry picture that we inadvertently make much worse, as our presence leads to a miscount in the number of permitted occupants, which triggers a civil protection raid. What follows is a frantic race to the roof of the building, where we weave in and out of various rundown homes with the Overwatch hot on our heels. After a brief scramble across the rooftops, Gordon ends up cornered, only to be saved by the friendly smile of Alex Vance, an associate of Dr. Kleiner who arrives just in the nick of time, and a character who will play a pretty massive role in the rest of the Half-Life 2 saga. Now, this might not all sound particularly novel, considering we have become drunk on prestige cinematic video games in recent years, but you have to remember that in 2004, this sort of thing was still really uncommon. In any other video game, this would have been a short cutscene, or maybe a more fleshed out chunk of gameplay, but in Half-Life 2, it's just a little blast of interactive excitement, one that reinforces the themes of oppression and rebellion, but does so without any loading screens or menus that might ruin your immersion. Now, as if Valve really wanted to drive home how much better they had become at storytelling, as soon as we arrive at Dr. Kleiner's lab, we're served up a scene that incorporates everything we've just spoken about in one tightly designed package. We get some new insight into Half-Life 2's world, as Dr. Kleiner tells us that he has built a teleporter based on the technology being researched back at Black Mesa, and the goal is to use this to help refugees escape from the city and hopefully form a cohesive resistance. We're also introduced to Dr. Eli Vance, Alex's father and another Black Mesa survivor, who operates his own lab out in the countryside, which is where we're headed once Kleiner gets his teleporter up and running. Essentially, the scene makes it clear that for all the talk of rebellion and alien empires, scientists still rule the roost. And while there aren't that many connective strands between Half-Life 2 and its predecessor, it's undeniably fun to hear Black Mesa and Gordon's past being mentioned. Now, if that covers the newfound emphasis on world building, the scene also makes the most of Valve's new NPCs, with all their complex animations and advanced presentation. A few minutes after we arrive, Barney turns up to check on the doctor, and we get this really great moment where he mentions a failed test on a cat, which spooks Alex and leads to the three of them talking over one another in a way that sounds really natural, like you're actually watching three old friends banter and bicker. Similarly, when Barney reveals that they have a HEV suit that Gordon can use, he ends up in a fight with Dr. Kleiner's pet head crab, Lamar, who we watch leaping around the laboratory, knocking things over, all while the doctor claims that he is no risk to humans beyond an attempted coupling. Again, these moments might not seem that impressive by the standards of modern cinematic blockbusters, but it was a huge leap forward from Half-Life 1, and even 6 years later, Valve's commitment to keeping you in control while the story plays out was still unlike anything in any other game. So to cap things off and thrust us into the meat of the experience, our time in Dr. Kleiner's lab ends with a little scripted piece of action, which comes when, surprise surprise, the teleportation experiment goes wrong. While Alex is sent over to Eli's lab with no issue, Gordon's trip ends up malfunctioning thanks to Lamar damaging the machinery, which sends him off on a wild series of teleports. At first, we're out in the east with Eli and Alex, but this doesn't last, as we find ourselves standing before Dr. Wallace Breen, who we later see reporting Gordon's sudden appearance to a strange, faceless monster, one of our few glimpses of an actual Combine alien. Luckily for Gordon, he ends up back on terra firma, but as he landed outside of Dr. Kleiner's lab, we now have to take the abandoned canalways on foot if we want to link back up with Alex and Eli, an objective that consumes the next few hours of Half-Life 2 and finally throws us into proper first-person shooter gameplay. Now, the overall point I am trying to make here is that while this scene is essentially a mirror of the resonance cascade in Half-Life 1, it is also a canvas to show off everything that Valve had learned since 1998. We get far more ambitious world building that is not just hinting at a wider world, but addressing it directly. Animations and dialogue that mean characters feel natural within their environments. Scenes constructed out of complex moving parts and exciting scripted drama, all of which mean that while you can look away at any point, nobody ever would. This all might be built on the foundation of Half-Life 1, but it is such a huge leap forward that the game is virtually unrecognisable as one in the same series. And my friends, that is before we have even started to talk about the gameplay. So while many people were excited to see the next phase of Gordon Freeman's story, the reality was that Half-Life 2's true appeal lay in its gameplay, and the promises made by Valve in all those ambitious E3 demos. Now on the surface, everything might look very similar to Half-Life 1, as after all, this is still a first-person shooter where you explore semi-realistic levels and bash in zombies with a crowbar. But just like in the game's narrative style, there are a lot more differences than you might expect from a numbered sequel. If you watched my previous video, you'll remember that Half-Life 1 was built on a variant of id Software's Quake engine, which Valve named Gold Source, and while it was used to create an extremely innovative game, you could still see the shadow of shooters that had gone before. Gordon's baseline movement speed was pretty high, the gunplay was fast-paced and demanded quick reflexes, you carried a big arsenal of different weapons of which you could only use one at a time, health and armour were finite resources, restored by finding pickups, and while it wasn't a punishingly difficult game, it was not afraid to throw you into a lot of deadly situations. Essentially, while Half-Life 1 was a supremely creative game, it was also very much a 1990s PC shooter, and it is in these more traditional aspects that its sequel tries to break new ground. Let's start with the most obvious difference, the Source engine, Valve's all-new in-house developed toolset that allowed for massive open spaces, complex enemy behaviour, and a level of interactivity that had never before been attempted. We'll get onto the enemies and physics in just a moment, but I want to start with something very simple that the Source engine adds, which is that it gives Half-Life 2 a much more weighty feel than its predecessor. Rather than zipping around at lightning speed, Gordon now moves with much more purpose, walking at a far slower pace, only being able to sprint for a limited time, jumping in a much more predictable way, and thankfully locking onto ladders in a manner that makes them impossible to fall off. These changes might sound very small, but they impact every second of gameplay, as the Source engine makes you feel as if Gordon is more than just a floating gun. Like he has an actual in-game body, which is something that many first-person shooters from the 90s and 2000s struggled to contend with. Now while this is felt first-hand by the player, it's also true of our enemies, which thanks to improved animations and the introduction of a complex physics system, all now feel very realistic and reactive. When you shoot a Combine officer, rather than triggering a preloaded animation of them collapsing, they might fall backwards over a railing or slump down a set of stairs, all of which happens randomly depending on the geometry they are standing in or what items are around them. This gives all of your foes a sense of tangibility that just wasn't possible in older game engines, and it gives encounters that would otherwise feel extremely straightforward, like using your pistol to gun down a few early game Metro cops, a very cinematic and engaging look. Now what's truly impressive about the new physics is that they go well beyond Gordon and his foes, and extend to almost every single item in the entire game. You can pick up paint cans and television sets, throw barrels and boxes, push over wardrobes and stack things on tables, with every item interacting with each other in a very believable way, crushing or bouncing or knocking things over in relation to their size and weight. Considering most games from this era rarely even had decorative objects, let alone ones that you could interact with, it is an extremely impressive system. But it is also more than just a technical gimmick, as Valve have incorporated these new systems into much of the gameplay. For example, grenades can now be thrown in two different ways, a powerful overarm throw and a gentle roll. And rather than firing and forgetting, you now have to factor in how they'll behave once you launch them, as they can bounce off walls or ceilings or roll off ledges if you aren't careful. Similarly, it allows for the more fantastical enemies to feel more realistic, like a new enemy called the Manhack, which are bladed attack drones that the Combine send after you in little swarms. As they fly through the air, when you hit them with a crowbar or shoot them with a gun, they'll rebound wildly, bouncing off of walls and objects in the environment or even each other, all of which turns every Manhack encounter into a frantic game of Half-Life baseball, as you try to follow their unpredictable movements and beat them backwards. Now, aside from jazzing up the enemies and combat, the Source engine also changed how Valve could design puzzles, as realistic physics opened up all sorts of new possibilities. In Half-Life 1, puzzles largely revolved around pressing buttons and opening doors, either because you needed to turn off or on some specific machine, or because you needed to locate a scientist or security guard who could unlock the way forward. These were often dressed up in slightly more engaging set dressing, but ultimately it was still quite traditional FPS design, which is exactly what Valve were trying to get away from in their blockbuster sequel. So instead of red keys and red doors, we now have the Seesaw, an all-new type of puzzle design that serves as the foundation for Half-Life 2's brain teasers, and only works thanks to its in-game physics. The idea is pretty straightforward. You enter a room and discover a seesaw-like platform, except that the end you need to be up is down, and you can't run from one end to the other in time to jump off. So rather than looking for some helpful NPC or a button that will flip the platform, you do what you would do in real life, either weighing down one end with heavy objects or jamming items underneath the other to prevent it from dropping. It's so intuitive that it can actually catch you off guard, as we've been conditioned to solve video game problems with video game logic, and the Seesaw represents a huge break from the kind of puzzle design you saw in games like The Legend of Zelda, Resident Evil, and yes, even Half-Life 1. Now the trouble is that while this was a mind-blowing piece of naturalistic game design, Valve hadn't actually figured out much more than the Seesaw. So rather than this being a taste of the complex physics puzzles to come, we get the same puzzle repeating throughout the game. In one spot we need to find floating plastic containers in order to lift up a ramp. In another, a washing machine provides a counterweight that lifts up a ramp. And in a third, you have to jam objects underneath a platform in order to make yet another ramp. It's disappointingly repetitive and actually takes some of the shine off of the idea, but thankfully there is still a hefty dose of tracing wires and flipping switches. Not exactly heavy-duty puzzle solving, but just enough so that you aren't only managing seesaws. Now, for those of you familiar with Half-Life 2, you will know that there is another big part of the physics engine that we are yet to talk about. A legendary new kind of weapon, but I want to save that for when we cover the level where it is introduced. So instead, let's change our focus and take a look at Gordon's more traditional firearms. Oddly, there is quite a bit less weapon variety than in Half-Life 1, as Valve have elected to bring back all the more grounded options, like the crowbar, revolver, shotgun, and machine gun, but have ditched all the weirder sci-fi stuff, like the Tau cannon, the glue-on gun, and my beloved snarks. While this is obviously a shame, as messing around with all the strange weapons was a big part of what made Half-Life 1 so good, this wasn't done without thought, as Valve clearly wanted to give each of your guns more character and add purposeful choice to the combat. Rather than just sticking to your favourite whenever it has ammo, Half-Life 2 wants you to be switching as the situation demands, using the revolver to blast high armour targets in close quarters, taking out the crossbow to snipe enemies from distance, or unloading at mid-range with the new lone addition, a combine pulse rifle. Thanks to killer sound effects, satisfying animations, and the addition of alternative fire modes for each gun, like the shotgun firing both barrels at once, or the pulse rifle spitting out a ball of bouncing energy, you never really get tired of these guns, despite having less to choose from. Funnily enough, this principle is also true of the enemies we fight, as there's been a real reduction in variety in favour of more complexity. If you remember, Half-Life 1 was really two kinds of shooter mashed together, as you were either battling alien monsters in frantic close quarters, or locked in tactical shootouts with the military, and the whole game built to a crescendo where these two factions started fighting each other, with Gordon trapped in the middle. Half-Life 2 does not repeat this formula, as from the minute we find our first gun to the moment the credits roll, we are fighting against the forces of the Combine, with a sprinkling of headcrab zombies and barnacles thrown in to provide variety, and absolutely none of the weirder aliens we saw in Black Mesa. That's right, gone are the Vortigaunts, the bull squids, the hound eyes, and the flying alien controllers, and in their place we get a very human-looking villains gallery, where even the more horrific designs have 2 arms and 2 legs. It's a decision that I can only imagine came from Victor Antonov's push towards greater realism, as some of the earlier Half-Life 2 concept art depicts all manner of weird sci-fi monsters, but none of this made it into the final version. It means that just like with its environments and narrative, Half-Life 2's enemies feel far more grounded than those in its predecessor. But just like with the weapons, it's a controversial change that allowed Valve to focus on creating much more interesting enemy behaviour. Take the headcrab zombies, the most basic enemy we fought in Half-Life 1 that did little more than wander towards you and swing their claws. Well, in the sequel, they still do that. They can also hit objects in the environment towards you, turning barrels and boxes into missiles, and if you blow them apart or cut them in two, the headcrab will often detach and start leaping towards you in the hope of finding a new host. On top of this, we're no longer fighting just one type of zombie, as there are terrifying, skinless variants that scream as they leap towards you, or horrible, blackened hunchbacks, covered in poisonous headcrabs which will drop you down to a single point of health if they manage to bite you. As each one obviously requires a different strategy in combat, they end up being just as different from each other as Black Mesa's weirder aliens. And thanks to them all having really distinct silhouettes and making noises that help identify them in a fight, it doesn't actually feel like we've lost that much variety, despite them all technically being different kinds of zombie. This design philosophy is also found in the Combine, whose forces make up the vast majority of the enemies we face, but have quite a lot of nuance hidden within their ranks. Now, just before we dive into how they work, it does need to be pointed out, the visual and audio design of the Combine's Metro Cops and Elite Soldiers is nothing short of iconic, and it's no surprise that they've gone on to become one of the most well-known sets of enemies in video game history. The white gas mask style helmets and glowing red lenses, the functional paramilitary-inspired body armour and combat boots, the way you hear them receiving and issuing orders in garbled codes during combat, and the splitting static of their radios that ring out when they're killed. It's just all such good design that perfectly blends the sci-fi inclinations of Mark Laidlaw and the more grounded art of Viktor Antonov. But of course, enemies are only as good as they feel to fight, and thankfully, just as much thought has gone into how the Combine conduct warfare. In the early game, we largely fight against Civil Protection, City 17's transhuman police force, and as they are little more than a poorly trained militia, they aren't particularly hard to deal with. They'll charge you down and hit you with batons or fire their pistols from range, but to be frank, being killed by these guys is virtually impossible. The thing is, the more chaos Gordon causes, the more firepower the Combine sends against him. By the mid-game, the Metro Cops are nowhere to be seen, and we're now fighting against an organised Combine military, armed with pulse rifles and machine guns, and more than capable of executing complex tactics. You'll see them throw grenades to flush you out of hiding, or provide covering fire while one armed with a shotgun charges towards you. They'll retreat when injured or if they need to reload. They'll try to flank you or set up pincer movements, and in the late game, they'll even use the alternative fire of their guns, which can cause some serious damage. Along with man-hacks that they can deploy mid-fight and all manner of turret positions, proximity mines and overhead gunships, the Combine's forces end up coming in all manner of different configurations. And again, this means that it never really feels like we're just fighting the same few enemies over and over. Essentially, Half-Life 2's combat and enemy design presents an excellent case that less is often more. But I do have one issue that is quite hard to ignore and stands in stark contrast to its predecessor. There is no escaping that Half-Life 2 is really very easy, and despite all the interesting nuances with its enemies and the creative ways that a fight can play out, this lack of difficulty means you will often blast straight past them. There is health and armour absolutely everywhere. It's virtually impossible to run out of ammo. Your weapons can kill most enemies in 1 or 2 shots. Traps and ambushes are pretty rare, and thanks to changes in enemies' AI, they are substantially less accurate than their Black Mesa equivalents. This means that the game is really pushing you to experiment or strategize, and it turns Half-Life 2 into more of a power fantasy sandbox, where you mix things up because you want to, rather than because you have to. And I think it's this that causes people to believe that there is less combat variety. For people who loved the deadly cut and thrust of Half-Life 1, a game that had very little issue blowing Gordon apart in encounter after encounter, this would have been a very disappointing change. But I think Valve did this because they're trying to tell a different kind of story with their sequel's gameplay. This is the tale of a heroic revolutionary, returning to humanity in its time of need and single-handedly beating back an alien invasion. an experience where you are meant to be a larger-than-life figure, capable of shrugging off bullet wounds and blowing apart squadrons of paramilitary monsters. In fact, there's another very slight change that makes me sure that this was the intention, as Half-Life 2 contains a much longer and much more prominent soundtrack, featuring all manner of high-energy electronic tunes that kick into gear almost exclusively during combat. This must mean that Valve weren't necessarily trying to deliver something that was purely immersive and realistic, and instead wanted their shooter to come with a heavy dose of blockbuster cinema, where you aren't just shooting enemies, but playing the role of a scientific superhero. Ultimately, I think this is what makes Half-Life 2 so compelling to play, because when you strip it down to its component parts, sure, it might sound something like a physics engine tech demo, or even like a step backwards in ambition from Valve's first attempt at first-person shooting. But the truth is, you aren't experiencing all of these things we've just discussed in isolation from one another, as the beauty of Half-Life 2 is that they are all happening all at once, repeating in patterns that you can never quite predict and practically begging for multiple playthroughs, just to see how differently a shootout can resolve. It's a crazy mess of chaotic physics, punchy weapons, iconic enemies, pulsating music, and cinematic action, all of which only exists because Valve were brave enough to not simply repeat the successes that they had already had. Now, if you can believe it, we are yet to talk about the single biggest difference between Half-Life 1 and 2. The latter's unique episodic structure, which defines the entire shape of the game and is still unlike any other first-person shooter. You see, despite all the wonderful variety that exists within this medium, most video games follow the same rough outline, starting with straightforward levels that introduce all of the gameplay mechanics, and then slowly ramping up in complexity and difficulty until the credits roll. In simple terms, it's the journey from shooting at undead marines with your pistol at the start of Doom, to the vast battles against the assembled hordes of hell during the finale, a classic video game gradient that Half-Life 1 had very much adhered to. What made that game so special was that it dressed this structure up in a very clever way, presenting its levels as different locations inside of the Black Mesa facility, and then flowing seamlessly between them without the use of menus. So, while you were still following a progression from the easy levels to the hard levels, it was done in a way that felt realistic and believable. This is still a very cool aspect of that game, but as with everything else we've discussed, Valve didn't want to repeat themselves. So it was decided early on that the sequel should take players outside of the walls of a single location, and deliver an experience full of lots of different kinds of environments that could house lots of different kinds of gameplay. Now, what's funny about this is that in Half-Life 2's opening hours, it is largely very similar to Half-Life 1, as we begin with that lengthy sequence of non-combat and world building, before diving into the action with a level called Root Canal. Here, Gordon is trying to make his way from Dr. Kleiner's labs to the outskirts of City 17, and this takes us through a series of drained canals and underground passageways as we're pursued by Combine Metro cops. In gameplay terms, it's that familiar Half-Life blend of light platforming, puzzle solving, lots of NPCs acting out little scenes, and a hell of a lot of first-person shooting. It is the purest expression of the series' gameplay, an action-packed shooter that wants to show off its creative ideas, immerse you in a realistic environment, and tell a story without lots of exposition. But here's the thing. Once Root Canal ends, this classic Half-Life 1 style of level design largely disappears and is replaced with something very different. You see, while the various chapters of Half-Life 2 still flow from one into the next, forming that continuous experience which was still very novel in 2004, the levels themselves are nowhere near as coherent as they were in Black Mesa, and are now built on extremely distinct and separate ideas. Now that might sound strange, but let me explain. Once Gordon has made his way through the canals, he arrives at a resistance outpost, where he's told that the only way he'll make it to Eli Vance's lab, which is amusingly nicknamed Black Mesa East, is to take a hovercraft and outrun the Combine's guns. What follows is a level called Water Hazard, a good hour-long chunk of gameplay that doesn't repeat anything we just saw in Root Canal, and is instead entirely focused around the mechanics of driving a boat. You race under bridges as metro cops try to rappel into your way, leap over makeshift ramps as a Combine airship screams overhead, dodge exploding mines and barrels as you drift around canal walls, all locked onto a tightly scripted and extremely linear pathway that is all about immediate, in-your-face action. While there are a few moments where we get out and fight a handful of Combine soldiers, or have to pause in order to solve a seesaw puzzle, the vast majority of your time on this boat is spent in blistering forward momentum. And the truth is, it doesn't look, sound, or feel anything like Half-Life 1. Now the odd thing is, that doesn't mean it's a bad level, and actually Water Hazard shows off just how good Valve had become at pacing out their ideas and taking a chunk of gameplay to its natural conclusion. You see, when we first set off, the canals are pretty simple to navigate and we're in virtually no danger, which gives you time to get used to the controls before things start to get heated. This comes in the form of more obstacles to avoid with less time to react, and eventually the addition of a Combine airship, which does its best to blow you out of the water and forces you to do everything at high speed. As I've already said, this is all surprisingly fun, but what makes this level truly sing is that Valve ends Water Hazard with a chance for revenge, as during a brief moment of respite, a friendly Vortigaunt attaches an SMG to your craft. Suddenly you have the ability to fire back, and during the last moments of the level, you're tearing through Combine forces that you were previously running away from, with everything climaxing in a glorious battle where you take out the gunship, set in a wide open lake bed against the backdrop of a gorgeous orange sunset. It is by no means mechanically complex, but as a piece of gameplay designed to reward the player, it is pitch perfect. And it leads us nicely into the cooling relief of Black Mesa East. Now, what I find impressive and baffling in equal measure is that in any other game, this would be the first of a few different linear obstacle course style vehicle sections. But in Half-Life 2 that is not the case, as we simply move on from these ideas and never look back. What follows Water Hazard is another completely distinct level, one with not only its own aesthetics and atmosphere, but gameplay unlike any in any other shooter. It begins once we are inside Black Mesa East, as we finally end up face to face with Dr. Eli Vance and his assistant, Dr. Judith Mossman, who are both overjoyed to have another scientist in their ranks, as unsurprisingly, they are in short supply in a post-Combine world. Unfortunately, once Alex arrives, it becomes clear that she and Dr. Mossman don't really see eye to eye, and after a short argument over the alignment of some such machine, Eli asks his daughter to take Gordon out into the yard and show him the 0-point energy field manipulator. This is Half-Life 2's most famous innovation, the gravity gun, a tool that allows you to mess around with the game's physics, letting you pick up or draw in any objects that aren't pinned down and then fire them forwards with a blast of kinetic energy. It is a pretty novel concept that is charmingly illustrated by a game of catch with Alex's pet robot, a lovable mechanoid called Dog. And after a few rounds with increasingly large objects, you're ready to take this new tool out onto the battlefield. But here's the thing, rather than the gravity gun simply slotting into our existing arsenal, we're thrust straight into a lengthy level dedicated entirely to its use, as a Combine ambush forces Gordon into a detour through the haunted town of Ravenholm. Now, Ravenholm is inarguably Half-Life 2's iconic sequence, a legendary video game level that has gone down in history thanks to its focus on physics-based combat, its hard pivot into traditional horror, and the endlessly quotable dialogue of Father Gregory, a half-crazed priest who helps Gordon navigate this cursed place. It's a wonderful hour of grim visuals and creative gameplay, but it needs to be pointed out that this is really nothing like any other part of Half-Life 2. And just like with Water Hazard, it feels more like a separate episode than part of a wider whole. For example, during our time in Ravenholm, we don't fight a single Combine soldier, as instead, this is where those disturbing headcrab zombie variants are introduced, all of which makes the combat much more visceral, as it's now dominated by hordes of screaming enemies that are trying to get in your face rather than shoot you from distance. Along with this, Valve does some clever things with the availability of resources, as Ravenholm contains much less ammo than normal, and this forces you to get creative and rely on the infinitely useful gravity gun. All over the town are things like broken signs, pieces of discarded metal and old gas canisters, all of which can be turned into effective weapons, and as we push deeper into the town, we find that Father Grigori has set up all manner of physics-based traps, things like motorized spinning blades and cars that drop from cables, all of which we can turn to our advantage. It might seem counterintuitive given that Half-Life 2 is a shooter, but this marginalization of your guns makes for extremely engaging combat. And to be frank, there is no shotgun blast or crossbow headshot that can compare to the satisfaction of slicing 6 zombies in half with a single serrated blade. Now, at the risk of pointing out the obvious, it's not just the gameplay that feels so distinct, as the aesthetics and atmosphere of Ravenholm are about 1,000,000 miles away from the brutalist Soviet sprawl of City 17, or the naturalistic vistas that we'll see later on. The town is presented as a pure piece of classical horror, where a bright moon shines down through cloudy skies, where long shadows stretch across dirty floors, where you grope around in the dark with your flashlight, and where the creeping silence is only punctured by inhuman screams. If we add in the booming pseudo-biblical sermon delivered by Father Grigori, who does just enough to stop you from feeling completely alone, and well, in Ravenholm, Valve have essentially crafted what is the perfect first-person level. But you already know what I'm going to say next, as once we escape the clutches of Grigori's fallen parish and emerge back into the light of day, we're thrust into something completely different. And within minutes, the memory of zombies and corpses and darkness fade beneath the roar of an engine. After a brief jaunt through a train station, where we have to avoid the blue lasers of entrenched Combine snipers, we find ourselves at a resistance base on the coast, where Alex radios in to tell Gordon that Eli and Mossman were captured during the raid, and that they've been taken to a prison called Nova Prospect. It is some distance away, so in order to meet Alex there in time, Gordon has to get himself a set of wheels, which launches us into Highway 17, yet another top-to-bottom reimagining of the core Half-Life formula, one that trades tight corridors and structured level design for wide, open space. Now, the cynical among you will likely be rolling your eyes, as after all, isn't this another vehicle sequence just like Water Hazard, which effectively ruins the point I'm making about Half-Life 2's episodic structure? Well, to that, I say you are wrong, as while we do indeed find ourselves zipping around in a custom-built buggy, Water Hazard and Highway 17 are very different experiences. For starters, the tightly directed forward momentum of Water Hazard is nowhere to be found, as instead, our journey up the coast is much more open, both in terms of its visuals and its gameplay. Gone are the high-walled canals and the gunship chasing us down, and in its place, we're driving across sprawling sandy beaches, navigating broad coastal roads, wandering across the railings of a massive railway bridge, all framed by sea mists that stretch off into the distance and sometimes yawn beneath us. It's just so much bigger in scope and scale, really feeling like we're out in the wilds far from civilization, a chunk of this world that is hostile and dangerous, but also strangely tranquil, something that feels especially poignant after the nightmare we went through in Ravenholm. Now, as I already mentioned, this sprawling scope is also reflected in Highway 17's design and gameplay. Each section of the map is littered with abandoned buildings, wrecked haulers, resistance bases and Combine checkpoints, all of which you can get out and explore or just blast past at full speed, which creates a sort of optional aspect that isn't present in any of the other highly linear levels, and which also defines Highway 17's new enemy. This is the antlion, an alien insectoid species that has taken root underground and will burst up and attack anything that they sense walking on the surface. An individual antlion isn't much of a threat, as they easily die from a quick burst from your shotgun, but as they continuously spawn while you're touching the ground and attack in groups of 6 or 7, they end up being a pretty massive problem if you're caught out in the open. So this naturally creates interesting moments of tension, where you might have to risk touching the ground to grab some ammo or health, or find yourself fighting inside of the protective bubble of a Combine thumper, Or alternatively, you might just want to stick to the safety of your buggy and drive straight through the swarm. The point is that Highway 17 is all about space and freedom, two concepts which could not be more alien to the tight corridors of Ravenholm and Root Canal, or the cinematic chaos of Water Hazard. Now, at the risk of repeating myself utterly ad nauseum, this episodic structure doesn't end here, as all the way to the credits, this concept of levels having their own unique mechanics and visual identity continues to persist. And really, it is this that defines Half-Life 2 far more than its combat design, or its story sequences, or its impressive tech. Once we arrive at Nova Prospect, we're thrust into a level where you gain control over the antlions via a throwable pod, which can then be used to set them against the Combine and turn the villains from Highway 17 into a powerful new weapon. This eventually gives way to a prison break, where the gimmicks are stripped back and the focus shifts to a mixture of narrative scenes and wave-based defense, where you're setting up turrets in blown-out cell blocks to defend Alex as she tries to rescue Eli. Even when we finally make our way back to City 17 and the rebellion kicks off in full force, it's still being done with space for new ideas, as the climactic battle against the Combine puts us in charge of squads of resistance soldiers, and which leads to a much more warlike atmosphere. The fact is that Half-Life 2 is beautifully incoherent, frequently looking, sounding, and feeling absolutely nothing like the game that it is supposed to be a sequel to. But in a weird way, I think it's this vibrant collage of ideas that makes it so memorable. Rather than constant iterations of the same few traditional first-person shooter concepts, we're instead served up short, sharp blasts of video game creativity, levels that burrow into your brain because they're allowed to be so unique. It means that there is simply no way you could ever confuse Half-Life 2 for any other game. And while its predecessor was a masterful conclusion for the type of design that made 90s shooters so popular, its sequel feels like something else entirely. Like it or not, this is a game utterly committed to doing things differently. And while so much of its legacy is tied up in its tech, or its story, or its lack of a sequel, for me, it will always be this weird and brave structure that sets Half-Life 2 apart from its peers. Now, in any other video about Half-Life 2, this is where we'd start talking about the game's big narrative climax, that inevitable conflict between Dr. Gordon Freeman, Dr. Wallace Breen, and the oppressive forces of the Combine. It is the ending that everything has been building towards since we first set foot in City 17. But rather than taking you to the credits with all the same gushing praise that I'm sure you've heard a million times before, we are going to plot a slightly different route. You see, despite everything we've discussed about Half-Life 2's impressive technical wizardry, its unique gameplay ideas, its bold artistic look, and its unconventional structure, we're about to discuss something borderline sacrilegious. I don't think the last few hours of Half-Life 2 are anywhere near as good as the rest of the game, and it is here, in its dying moments, that Valve's more peculiar decisions come back to haunt them. So let's start with the story, as you might have noticed that it's taken something of a backseat to all the wild gameplay systems and complex level design. Well, the truth is that Half-Life 2 doesn't actually have a lot of story to tell, and in my opinion, it gets caught between the immersive environmental vagary of the first game and its sequel's focus on characters, world building, and actually having a plot. You see, Half-Life 1 was not a narrative-driven game. And while there are a few memorable dramatic scenes, like the Resonance Cascade or the G-Man abducting Gordon, there's virtually no exposition and very little in the way of direct storytelling. Instead, you're meant to experience it through the little things you see while moving through its levels. And as the world building is purposefully vague, it creates this wonderful sense that there is more going on at Black Mesa than just Gordon Freeman's battle to survive. The trouble with Half-Life 2 is that it wants to maintain this style, where we're never taken out of its first-person perspective and where everything happens around Gordon in real time, but it also wants to have a grand dramatic plot with an active cast of characters, and the uncomfortable truth is that these two ideas don't really mesh. Now, for the first half of Valve's sequel, this isn't really a problem, as all we're doing is learning about the world and being introduced to its various figures, either through chunks of that same immersive exploration, or by watching more heavily directed scenes of dialogue. These work because they are low stakes and low action, but when your narrative concerns a planet-wide revolution, the drama does eventually need to ramp up, and it's here that the cracks in this storytelling approach begin to show. We get a first taste of this in Nova Prospect, where Gordon and Alex discover that Black Mesa East's location had been given up by Judith Mossman, who cut a deal with the Combine, where she'd hand over Gordon in exchange for Eli's safety. It's a big narrative revelation, the classic trope of a traitor in our midst, but the way it's delivered really diminishes its impact, as we simply stand in front of a small screen listening to a barely animated Mossman speaking with Dr. Breen, who isn't even in the player's view. In functional terms, it's more like a radio drama than a piece of cinematic storytelling, and it highlights the issue with needing everything to be viewed from Gordon's perspective, as events that advance the plot either have to be twisted to appear in front of you, or have to happen off-screen, and in the case of the latter, it's quite hard to do this without it feeling clumsy. To give you another example, Nova Prospect ends with Gordon and Alex managing to find both Judith and Eli, but as they try to fire up a Combine teleporter to get back to the Resistance, Judith is able to reprogram the machine and takes Dr. Vance with her, leaving our heroes stranded. It's an exciting little sequence because it's happening in real time, and as you watch Eli and Judith teleporting away and hear Alex's cries of frustration, it feels like a natural step up in intensity from the playable cutscenes we saw earlier in the game. Now luckily Gordon and Alex are able to fight off the Combine and use the device to port back to Dr. Kleiner's lab, but upon arrival he tells them that this process has taken an entire week, and while they've been gone, the Resistance have launched their uprising and thrown City 17 into a state of anarchy. This is the catalyst for a multi-level climactic battle for the freedom of Earth, but it's yet another awkward example of the interesting thing happening off-screen, as Valve have no way to show the revolution sparking into life without Gordon being physically present. Instead, we are just told about it in the most blunt expository way possible, and I think this is a real step backwards from the immersive mystery that pushed us through Half-Life 1. Now, if you can believe it, this isn't even the most egregious example, as a few hours later, Alex is captured by the Combine, but in order to orchestrate this, we have to sit through a very strange scene, where she slowly climbs up a building in order to take her out of the player's direct sight, before a few gunshots and a single Combine soldier indicate that she's been taken prisoner. To be frank, it looks absolutely terrible and feels absurd to be trapped down on the street as Gordon, standing in absolute silence, a move that ironically makes the whole scene feel so much less immersive, despite this being the point of these directorial decisions. Now, funnily enough, Half-Life 2's actual conclusion manages to largely sidestep this problem, although it isn't completely free of issues, but we'll park that train of thought for just a moment, as I want to talk about the gameplay during these last few levels. As we have already discussed at length, this game has a very unique structure, where all of its levels are wildly distinct from one another, but I feel like this starts to lose steam past Nova Prospect, as Valve runs out of big and bold concepts to build their levels around. For example, in the second half of our time in Nova Prospect, during a level called Entanglement, the gimmick, so to speak, is placing automated turrets and fighting off waves of Combine soldiers, a premise that is nowhere near as compelling as a fast-paced dune buggy or a town full of horrifying zombies. It's still somewhat fun thanks to the well-designed core of Half-Life 2's combat, but without anything to meaningfully mix up the gameplay or provide new challenges, this can start to become a little repetitive, an issue that only gets worse when we arrive in City 17. Here the idea is that you fight alongside various teams of NPC Resistance fighters and can order them to attack specific locations or hang back and provide backup, a set of mechanics that is obviously supposed to add a greater sense of scale to the combat, as you're now fighting a full-blown war. Admittedly, these levels do have a pretty cool aesthetic, as it can feel like you're fighting across a sort of sci-fi version of Stalingrad, where the totalitarian order we saw during the game's opening has been replaced with crumbling buildings and running street battles. As a way to conclude Half-Life 2, it makes a lot of sense, but disappointingly, it's marred by that growing issue of repetition, as really, all we do for the 2 hours that it takes to topple the regime is fight an endless onslaught of Combine soldiers, a gameplay loop that is at its best when it's broken up between other ideas. Now, this too much of a good thing issue is perfectly exemplified by the finale's lone new enemy, the Strider, a beautifully designed tripedal monster that unloads intense firepower as it bobs and weaves above the battlefield. As each one takes 7 rockets to take down and can easily kill you if they catch you out in the open, they are a spike in difficulty that these late game levels badly need. But for as undeniably cool as they look, Valve ends up draining the Striders of this novelty through an absurd amount of overuse. We first encounter them in a level called Follow the Freeman, in the courtyard of a Combine government building, where we have to dodge their fire until we find a box of rockets, which allows us to take out the 4 Striders hounding our position. Once that's done, another 2 wander onto the battlefield, which requires another set of 7 rockets each. And as a reward for victory, we get to fight yet another Strider, this time taking place in a blown out building next to a Combine highway. It takes the total number of Striders fought in the level to 7, and of course 49 rockets fired. But Valve aren't done yet, as we are then thrown into a final battle in a collapsing city block, where we fight Combine soldiers and gunships, and yes, 2 more Striders, which means a grand total of 63 rockets required to beat this part of the game. Even if you love the design of these creatures and the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics they force you to employ, it's just not fun to do anything this many times in a row. Just like how we fight the same Combine soldiers over and over with no variation, it drains the joy from what should be an extremely engaging piece of first-person action. Ultimately, it's not even like these sequences are that bad, as they do feel suitably climactic, but it's just that they represent a palpable dip in creativity from the game's first half, where every few minutes we were doing something interesting and new. It's really just the curse of success, where average can feel disappointing when you've set the bar so high. And unfortunately for Valve, that is exactly what plagues Half-Life 2's later levels. Now, the veterans of Half-Life 2 among you will know that there is still one pretty big new idea that we are yet to talk about, a chunk of gameplay that has largely defined how the game's finale has been remembered. But here, I want to take a step back and talk about the parts of Half-Life 2's ending that aren't quite as compelling. Eventually, our fight in City 17 brings us to the walls of the Citadel, where Barney informs us that Alex and Eli have been taken to Dr. Breen, yet another major event that happens off-screen, and one which requires us to charge into the heart of the Combine beast. This initially seems as if it's going to be an extremely cool sequence, as once inside the perimeter, we're given a moment to marvel at the sheer immensity of the Citadel, a sleek alien colossus that stretches far up into the clouds and deep under the earth. It has loomed over us for almost the entire game, a symbol of the Combine's power here on Earth, but up close you realise just how alien it truly is, and as we step inside of its weird gunmetal architecture, it feels like we're moving away from Antonov's grounded and gritty realism. This could easily be Half-Life 2's Zen moment, where the aesthetic and tone pivot into something abstract and otherworldly. But sadly, that isn't really what we find inside of the Combine headquarters. Rather than being a proper level in its own right, the Citadel is sort of a big nothing, as all we do is hitch a ride on a prison conveyor belt, and then watch in silence as we pass troops heading up to battle, gunships being built, and a few human-like drones tapping away on consoles. It is all surprisingly uninteresting, and I've really struggled to work out what the point of this sequence is, as it doesn't show us anything about the Combine that we haven't already seen elsewhere. The best I can come up with is that it's meant to parallel the opening train ride of Half-Life 1, but even this doesn't really make sense, as that was all about introducing you to the world of Black Mesa, which doesn't need to be done in the sequel when we're minutes away from the end. Regardless of the purpose, it means that our first taste of the Citadel is a pretty underwhelming auto-scroller that takes a good 5 minutes to complete. But thankfully, once we step off of the railing, Valve switches things up in an extremely satisfying way. You see, Gordon is dumped into a suppression field that destroys his weapons, but when the field connects with the gravity gun, something goes wrong, and the device ends up becoming not only supercharged, but able to manipulate organic matter. What follows is a completely brainless and totally wonderful parade of slaughter, where Dr. Breen sends wave after wave of elite Combine soldiers to stop the invading Dr. Freeman, all of whom fall beneath the awesome power of your new upgraded gravity gun. As there are health stations around every corner that take your armor up to 200, it's just unfettered power fantasy. A last-minute blast of gameplay that wants you to cut loose and feel like the mythological superhero that Gordon Freeman is constantly being described as. Now, this is largely what people focus on when discussing Half-Life 2's ending, and with good reason, as it's an incredibly memorable part of the game, but it does set up a slight problem, which is, what do you do next? You can't end things with a traditional boss fight, as it wouldn't be enjoyable to go back to a normal power level, so instead, Valve are forced into more of a cinematic conclusion. But as we've already discussed, I'm not sure that this plays to their strengths. So after a full serving of upgraded gravity gun chaos, Gordon ends up being captured, and is escorted by the traitor Judith Mossman into the offices of Dr. Breen, who is desperately trying to convince a restrained Eli Vance that the only future for humanity lies in being absorbed into the collective of the Combine. Eli is having none of it, and even when Alex is brought out and threatened, the old man won't agree to call off the revolution, and won't sign up to Dr. Breen's mad, transhumanist evolutionary ideals. Frustrated, the Combine administrator turns his attention to Gordon, threatening to send Alex and Eli through a portal to a hellish other dimension if he doesn't cooperate. But this proves to be a step too far for Mossman, who clearly regrets her earlier actions and doesn't want to see the Vance family hurt, but as she attempts to free our protagonists, Breen manages to slip away. It is a great bit of storytelling, but it does have to be said that this only looks so good because Gordon is held in restraints, which allows Valve to manipulate our viewpoint and effectively turns this into a traditional cutscene. It's funny that for all the earlier twisting of events to maintain their signature style, eventually Valve just decided to give in to the allure of more normal storytelling. But it does work, so no complaints from me. Although the same can't be said for what happens when Gordon and Alex catch up to Dr. Breen. Turns out that the eloquent old fool is trying to teleport away from Earth, a process that requires the Citadel to fire up its dark matter generator, a machine that, if destroyed, would stop the Combine from sending reinforcements and effectively liberate Earth. It is a golden opportunity, so armed with the recovered gravity gun, Gordon heads up to the roof, and amidst a hail of gunship fire, the cries of Wallace Breen, and the strange vision of a sickly Combine dimension, we blow the machine back to Kingdom Come. It is the moment of our victory, except all of a sudden, everything freezes. And from an impossible angle, materializing out of thin air, an all too familiar blue-suited man walks towards the screen. This time, there is no choice to live or die, as the G-Man promptly whisks Gordon away, leaving Alex frozen in place and the Citadel mid-explosion, all the while apologising for what he describes as the arbitrary imposition and his lack of any explanations. The last thing we see in Half-Life 2 is our bureaucratic jailer adjusting his tie and stepping into a brilliant white doorway, leaving us in the darkness with nothing but the credits for company. That's right, Half-Life 2 ends with another cliffhanger, and for many people, this has become part of the series' identity. A strange tale of a hero who is picked up and plucked out of various conflicts while never really understanding what is being asked of him. It is the way this ending has been spoken about for over 2 decades, but here I have to break with the consensus, as I really don't like the way this final scene plays out, especially the decision to end things unresolved. If you cast your mind back to Half-Life 1, the sudden appearance of the G-Man worked so well, not because it left the story hanging, which in fact it did not, as our final act was to defeat the Nihilanth and end the invasion of Black Mesa, but because this strange scene expanded the scope of Half-Life's world. You're left wondering who this mysterious character is, what they want with Gordon, who exactly their employers are, and what sort of power they wield. All tantalising questions because they hint at a universe beyond the borders of Black Mesa and redefine the story that we've just experienced. The cliffhanger in Half-Life 2 does none of this. And while it's extremely dramatic to have the G-Man appear mid-explosion, his dialogue doesn't reveal anything new about this world, or reveal anything that might change our understanding of the game on a second playthrough. We leave Half-Life 2 exactly as we arrived, knowing absolutely nothing. And while the suspense alone might be enough for some people, I think this narrative trick loses its impact second time around. And in my opinion, this sudden way of bringing the narrative to a close is just more evidence that in Half-Life 2's final hours, Valve had simply run out of good ideas. So at this point we should probably take a moment and calm down a little, as that was quite a lot of negativity, and I don't want to make it sound like I am trying to convince you that Half-Life 2 is a bad game. The reality is that even with everything we've just discussed, this is still a video game of magnificent ambition, full of truly groundbreaking technology, interesting and original artistic decisions, and gameplay ideas that feel as novel today as they did 2 decades ago. If we consider that this game emerged out of a development process that could not have been more chaotic, it's hard to argue that Half-Life 2 is anything other than a miracle. But that doesn't necessarily mean it is the masterpiece of a video game that its modern reputation would have you believe. Just like how we need to guard against hype before a game comes out, sometimes I think it's also important to do that years later, and to acknowledge that a game doesn't need to be perfect to be worth remembering. So on this note, I think we should move on to the next stage of our investigation, because if Half-Life 2's flaws have quietly faded away over time, the messy aftermath of its release and the reasons behind Valve's next set of moves, well, these have been utterly forgotten. Now this might seem like an obvious point to make, but if you sit down at your computer and boot up Half-Life 2 in 2026, the experience will not be the same as the one people were having in 2004, and it is in this difference that we find an often forgotten but rather serious problem. It might be hard to believe considering it would go on to become the face of modern PC gaming, but when Steam launched alongside Half-Life 2, it was extremely unpopular, and the first few years of its existence cast a real shadow over Valve and the game they had just released. You see, this supposedly trailblazing program was riddled with issues, as it was slow and full of bugs, its networking systems were always breaking, it needed almost daily updates that prevented you from playing games, and worst of all, it required a constant internet connection to even work. This was a huge issue for Half-Life 2, as it meant you could not access the game without initially being connected to the internet, even if you bought a physical copy, which still required an install of Steam. In 2004, only 50% of Americans had access to the internet, with far lower rates in the rest of the world, and as the vast majority of these connections were provided via cheap dial-up rather than broadband, there were huge amounts of people who wanted to play Half-Life 2, but quite literally couldn't. Now, I don't usually get anecdotal in these videos, but this was actually my first experience of Half-Life 2. As the week it released, I went round to a friend's house to check out this incredible shooter that he had been utterly raving about. Unfortunately for us, that day his mum was expecting an important phone call, so we couldn't use the internet, couldn't get into Steam, and thus couldn't play Half-Life 2. The whole thing left me utterly baffled, as the idea of a single-player game having anything to do with the internet sounded completely ridiculous. And of course, it meant that I did not end up buying the game myself, until years later when broadband arrived in my town. Now, you could write this off as an isolated incident, but there are similar stories all over the internet. So it was clearly a big blocker for many people in 2004 and 2005. But what makes this early example of mandatory DRM even more cynical is that Valve knew this would happen and actively tried to hide it. You see, rather than sending early review copies to websites and magazines, they instead flew journalists out to a fancy hotel in Seattle, where they played through the game on extremely high-end machines over the course of a few days. It meant that none of those glowing reviews were able to comment on Steam's functionality, which would have surely lowered the average score. And to be frank, I strongly suspect that this event was also responsible for most of the game's issues being quietly ignored, as you're hardly going to be objective when Valve have paid for you to go on holiday. Really, it is one of the first ever high-profile examples of access journalism bribery, and sadly, it meant that many buyers were picking up Half-Life 2, absolutely clueless about if they could even run it. Now, on that note, I also need to point out another post-release problem, which was that all of Valve's groundbreaking tech and next-gen visuals were not exactly budget build friendly, and this meant that unless you had a fairly respectable machine, you were not going to be fighting through City 17. It's an issue that's pretty common when it comes to cutting-edge PC games, but 2005 was quite a unique year, in that most of the best-selling games on the platform, like Civilization 4, World of Warcraft, The Sims 2, Rome Total War, and Battlefield 2 were not particularly graphically intensive, and this made that required upgrade for Half-Life 2 look like little less value for money. The fact of the matter was that during those first few years, Half-Life 2 was very much a game for hardcore PC gaming enthusiasts, those who had already invested in top-end gear and an internet connection. And this leaves us staring down the barrel of quite a surprising revelation, one that most people seem to entirely miss when talking about Valve's history. Despite the soaring critical acclaim, Half-Life 2 was not a huge hit when it first came out, and initially this much anticipated sequel actually underperformed against Valve's financial expectations. Now, we don't have concrete sales figures from those first few years, which is a pretty big red flag in of itself, but there are unsubstantiated claims that Half-Life 2 had only sold 600,000 copies in the US in its opening 12 months, a figure that seems to be backed up by message board chatter that refers to Steam having just 200,000 users on launch. Considering that Newell had once claimed he wanted to sell 15 million copies in the game's first 2 years, these were not the sort of numbers that Valve had expected, and they meant that whatever happened next for the series needed to be dramatically different to the lengthy and expensive production that had created Half-Life 2. Now, just before we dive into what exactly this meant, I want to address how this part of Half-Life 2's legacy has been seemingly forgotten, because you'd be hard-pushed to find anyone else describing the game as anything less than an instant success. Well, the confusion comes from the fact that Half-Life 2 did eventually sell a lot of copies. By late 2008, momentum had really picked up, and Valve reported that it had sold 6 million copies, which grew to 12 million by 2011, and then as many as 20 by the 2020s. And it is these numbers that people often use, missing that there is strong reason to suspect that it had started off much more slowly. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this incredible turnaround that we'll explore during the rest of the video, but before we move on, I want to mention a particularly ironic one, which was Half-Life 2's constant availability on Steam. Thanks to its reputation as a stellar video game, frequent and deep discounts, and the fact that eventually almost any machine could run it, Half-Life 2 transformed into one of those evergreen PC games, a title that virtually anyone with Steam would end up owning. Considering that this platform had originally stopped many people from being able to play it, it's pretty funny that it is also the mechanism that allows Half-Life to live on. So while young Matt might have been confused about Valve's new direction, clearly Gabe Newell and his team knew best all along. Anyway, let's rewind back to before this grand recovery, as in 2005, Valve began to release a steady stream of Half-Life 2 content, all designed to keep the game alive and draw in new fans. The first was Half-Life 2: The Lost Coast, an interesting little chunk of game released for free via Steam in October of 2005, which was intended to show off all the impressive stuff that the team had been working on. In essence, it is a tech demo, built from a cut sequence originally in Highway 17, where Gordon fights the Combine across a small fishing village and a clifftop Orthodox church. A very basic premise that is more intended to show off the Source Engine's new HDR capabilities than introduce any new gameplay ideas. That might sound a little boring, and sure, it's nothing we haven't seen before, but the visual effects are very nice, and it would give a taste of what would be coming next. Now, this was widely expected to be a full-blooded Half-Life 2 expansion pack, which Valve had hinted at in a couple of post-release interviews, even going as far as to give it a name, Half-Life 2 Aftermath. But it was actually a very different kind of technical marvel that hit store shelves next. You see, since the release of Half-Life 1 back in 1998, home consoles had exploded in popularity, and this was a market that Valve wanted to tap into, especially as series like Halo and Medal of Honor had proved that the FPS genre was now a big moneymaker in the living room. Obviously, this wasn't entirely new territory for the Half-Life series, as in 2001, Sierra had contracted Gearbox to produce a surprisingly good PS2 port of Half-Life 1, but this time around there would be no such outsourcing, as Valve wanted to do the work themselves. Their platform of choice was the Xbox, as it was the most powerful machine of the generation, and had hardware that most closely resembled a home computer, something that was very important as Half-Life 2 for the Xbox was developed alongside Half-Life 2 for the PC. This was not a common move for console ports of PC games, which were often hacked to pieces in order to get them running on much weaker hardware. But when Half-Life 2 released in November of 2005, this strategy had clearly paid off. Despite being an extremely taxing PC game, the Xbox version of Half-Life 2 is virtually identical, replicating all the varied environments, all the complex NPC animations, every single moment of gameplay, and even porting the physics engine in full, something that is barely believable considering the console only had 64 megabytes of RAM. It is a technical marvel, and at the cost of slightly less detailed textures, some slowdown when things get particularly hectic, and a handful of extra loading points, players with a controller were getting exactly the same experience as players with a keyboard and mouse. Now, this was actually quite a big deal, as it meant people without an internet connection or a powerful enough computer could actually play Valve's game. And as one of those poor fools, I can tell you firsthand that nobody cared about the inferior performance if it meant they got to see City 17. Thanks to this, the Xbox version reviewed very well, with many publications even calling it the best Xbox game of the year. But unfortunately for Valve, its mainstream thunder was rather stolen by the release of the Xbox 360, which had come out a few months earlier and had already moved the graphical conversation well beyond Half-Life 2. Now, returning to the story at hand, while free levels on Steam and impressive console ports were all very cool, it was the PC expansion that really had people excited about the future of Half-Life. But in true Valve fashion, this simple idea quickly became extremely complicated. Depending on the retrospective you watch or the interview you read, you'll often get different explanations for what Valve did next. But to my mind, the next phase of their history was rooted in two problems that needed one solution. The first we've already covered. The Half-Life 2 was initially a slow seller, and that the company needed to produce their next game at a much faster rate, not only to justify new users joining Steam, but because they literally couldn't afford another 6 years in development. Now, the second problem was very similar, as after near constant crunch and crisis, the team at Valve were absolutely exhausted, and when they sat down to map out their next move, there wasn't a single person in the room who wanted to repeat what they had just been through. So the solution they came up with was the Half-Life 2 episodes, a set of 3 much smaller games that would take the loose ideas behind Aftermath and turn them into something that had never been done before, an annual, ongoing series. This was really the first time that anyone had attempted to do something like this in video game form, but with an engine that still had a lot of juice left in the tank, a team keen to work on much smaller projects, and a platform in Steam that could actually distribute it, there was little risk in trying out this experimental form of publishing. So in 2005, work began on both Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Half-Life 2 Episode 2, which were developed side by side by two separate teams. Now, interestingly, the leadership of the episode projects looks very different to that of Half-Life 2, as Gabe Newell took a step back from dictating specifics, trusting direction duties to series veterans Robin Walker and David Sprayer, while also giving Mark Laidlaw and his writing team much more freedom to dictate where the story went. Sadly, there was another big name missing from the team, as Viktor Antonov, the visionary artistic brain behind Half-Life 2's art style, left the company right as the episodes went into production, claiming in interviews later that he didn't want to work on small projects with small ideas. That might sound slightly bitter, but luckily for us, Antonov would go on to join Arcane Studios, where he designed the city of Dunwall for Dishonored, yet another incredibly unique video game environment. And while he sadly passed away in 2025, his contribution to both of these legendary series will never be forgotten. So, exactly 1 year after the episodes were first announced, on June 6, 2006, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 released on Steam and in standalone physical form. Many commentators said it was the start of a new era for video game publishing, and while that might not have been exactly true, it absolutely was a new era for Half-Life and Valve. Half-Life 2 Episode 1 is a peculiar game to talk about, because while it is full of sleek design, technical brilliance, and all manner of interesting little details, it is a surprisingly unambitious follow-up to Half-Life 2, especially when compared to the parade of big ideas you usually find in Valve's work. Now, before we start to unpick this strange concoction, we need to first address how we are even here, as Half-Life 2's cliffhanger ending doesn't easily lead into a direct sequel. Funnily enough, this was not lost on the media and fans, as in interviews before its release, Valve staff members were constantly asked about who these episodes would revolve around, with many speculating that the episodes would star Alex and be set sometime before Gordon's arrival. Given this was the approach taken by Gearbox for the Half-Life 1 expansions, the theory made a lot of sense, but Valve had other ideas, and instead they simply carried on as if nothing had happened. That's right, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 opens with Gordon being immediately freed from the G-Man by a group of Vortigons, who then drop him and Alex off on the outskirts of the Citadel, a narrative decision that I have always found to be quite odd. We see Vortigons all throughout Half-Life 2, often using their psychic powers to assist in laboratories or work in resistance bases, but they're never portrayed as particularly high-powered beings. So to see them overpowering a character who is effectively omnipotent, well, it marks quite a change in how we see them. To my mind, this doesn't really fit with their history of enslavement at the hands of the Nihilanth, and as we never get any explanation for their knowledge of the G-Man or Gordon's captivity, you pretty much have to accept that Valve are playing fast and loose with their world building in order to facilitate a direct sequel. Anyway, once we take control of Gordon, we are quickly introduced to our initial objective, as with the help of her trusty robotic dog, Alex manages to radio her father and Dr. Kleiner, who inform her that the Citadel is going into meltdown and that the Resistance are trying to evacuate the city. Despite Eli's pleas for them to get to safety, Alex and Gordon decide that they have to do something. So we find them climbing into a blown-out car and being thrown by Dog back into the Combine stronghold, all so that they can find a way to avert this coming disaster. This sends us straight into the first big chunk of gameplay, where we move through the now ruined Citadel, fight leftover Combine soldiers with a re-upgraded gravity gun, solve new kinds of puzzles that require Alex's input, and generally take in some pretty environmental effects, as the building collapses around us as we push towards the core. It's a finely crafted sequence, where real thought has been poured into every inch of the player's experience, but it suffers from a lethal issue which plagues the entirety of Episode 1. All of this has a very familiar feeling. Now, given this is an expansion pack, you might find that to be a slightly harsh criticism, but the trouble is that this was not how Valve advertised Episode 1. as Gabe Newell had been very clear that this wasn't just a case of more Half-Life 2. In fact, he specifically told the media that he considered the episodes to be the equivalent of Half-Life 3, a claim that conjures images of something bold and brave, an episode full of big ideas just like we had seen in the base game. Rather than this, we've instead got something that seems to be built around reusing content and refining older concepts, a direction which would be totally acceptable for any other game but feels slightly boring by Half-Life's lofty standards. To further prove the point, let's jump ahead a little, as once the problem with the Citadel core has been resolved, Alex and Gordon end up hitching a ride on a Combine train. But unfortunately, this comes off the rails and leaves them to fight their way to safety through the ruins of City 17. This takes us into a series of underground roadways, where we fight hordes of headcrab zombies and resurgent antlions, before we emerge on the surface and dive into a big chunk of urban warfare against the last remaining Combine forces. Now there are some pretty awesome moments contained within these levels. An extremely well-designed sequence that blends platforming, puzzle solving and combat in the Citadel core, a tense last stand in the pitch black against an incoming horde of zombies, a gunship fight that takes place in a hospital attic that slowly collapses into rubble, and even a reworked Strider battle to round out the expansion, complete with more moves, more drama and far more intensity. It is a very well-designed video game, but it's hard to ignore that these environments and set pieces are very similar to things we have seen before, and that this issue is even worse if you go straight from Half-Life 2 into Episode 1. We are essentially playing the final few levels in reverse, and it means that all the clever little touches get lost in an experience that, broadly speaking, lacks that bold creative spark that originally got people so excited about this game and this studio. Now, I think another big reason that Episode 1 can lack impact is that Valve did actually go into this project with a big, high-concept goal, but it ended up producing something that is supposed to sit in the background, complementing the player's actions rather than pulling focus. This is Alex, or the new Alex that Valve redesigned top to bottom for Episode 1, as the team wanted to create the most complex companion in video game history, and have her accompany Gordon through every single second of the expansion. It's one of those ideas that doesn't sound particularly impressive when you say it out loud, but in reality, this was a doozy of a project, as the team needed to create thousands of little interactions, animations and voice lines, and then create AI systems that could deliver them all in a way that felt natural. For example, she might make a comment in response to the player doing a specific action, or crack a joke if you look at a certain item, all of which add a lot of character to the relationship between her and Gordon, making them feel like friends and not just silent accomplices. Along with this, it gives Valve another way to mix up the tone, as previously this would have been entirely done with the gameplay and music. But with Alex, they can do little things to break up a section of intensity or drive home the seriousness of another. This and virtually every other part of her design, from her movement speed to how often she reminds you of your objectives, to when and how her animations trigger, all had to be meticulously tested and tweaked over and over again, driving the developers mad with all the bugs and weird interactions that had to be ironed out. But the results speak for themselves. Companion characters have often skewered the very best developers, but the Alex of Episode 1 is brimming with life in a way that she never was in the base game. And on top of all the neat little details that build her character and contribute to the narrative, Valve have also managed to cook up some interesting ways to bring her more into the gameplay. My personal favourite is during the underground sequence after you've escaped the Citadel, which takes place mostly in pitch black darkness, where you can only see if you turn on your flashlight, throw a flare, or set a zombie on fire. What's cool about this is that Alex will only fire on things that she can see, so the gameplay has this really cool spotting mechanic, where you'll indicate targets for her to attack without even really thinking about it, which drives home the core fantasy that you are working together. If I'm honest, this whole section is easily the best part of the expansion, as it also shows off the new HDR lighting that Valve first previewed in The Lost Coast. being used here to create darkness and light that still look great by modern standards and were positively mind-blowing in 2005. On top of this, it also contains Episode 1's sole new enemy, the Zombine, a name cooked up by Alex to describe armoured headcrab zombies, which add a big dose of chaos to this episode's fights, as they're much stronger than their citizen-born brethren and can pull out grenades to turn themselves into kamikaze berserkers. Essentially, the whole sequence is Valve at its very best, blending technological innovation with clever gameplay ideas. But outside of our time in the dark, all that effort that Valve poured into Alex can sometimes fade into the background. The issue is that because she is so complementary to the player's actions, carefully designed to never get in the way during combat or to annoy you with too many voice lines or to take centre stage in any one particular mechanic, she doesn't feel as exciting as a gun that turns objects into weaponry or a fully controllable dune buggy. She is a magnificent piece of technical video game design, but it's not the sort of thing that causes your jaw to drop. Ultimately, I think it's this dynamic that defines the design of Episode 1, as almost everything that made Half-Life 2 tick has been refined and improved, with levels that blend gameplay ideas together far more seamlessly, enemy encounters that more than stave off that creeping repetition, a wonderfully realised companion that adds a lot to the experience, but none of the spark that made the base game so memorable. In fact, I think the episode's narrative sums this up perfectly, as while there is a faint hint of something interesting, in the form of a combine breeding pod that we stumble across while exploring the Citadel, and a mysterious message from Judith Mossman, you could pretty much skip to the end without missing anything important. Alex and Gordon prevent the meltdown, they fight their way across City 17, they help some stragglers get to safety, and then they escape on a train, which is derailed as the Citadel finally explodes, taking us to the credits. It is all perfectly functional, but it's hard to shake that sense that Valve made this game because they needed an episodic chunk of Half-Life, rather than because they had specific gameplay ideas that they wanted to explore, or because they had a specific story that they were desperate to tell. Now, before we wrap this chapter up, we have one last thing to talk about, because there is a shadow looming over Half-Life 2 Episode 1 that can make or break this experience, depending on the year in which you play it. Amazingly, Episode 1 tops out at just 3 hours in length, a measly runtime that is very short by the standards of most PC expansion packs, and looks even worse when you consider that Valve were selling it for $25. Even for the most fanatical of Half-Life fans, this was not great value for money, and led to a lot of accusations that the idea of annual episodic releases was more about making money than making interesting games. Now, the funny thing is, like many other things in this video, this criticism of Episode 1 has been largely forgotten, as within just a few years, Valve had stopped selling it on its own and started bundling it in with the base game. This got rid of that high price of entry and also softened the short runtime, as in this form, which happens to be how most people ended up playing it, Episode 1 feels more like an additional episode and less like a standalone product. It's a subtle distinction, but one that has worked in Valve's favour, and means that when you're playing Episode 1 in 2026, safe in the knowledge that this is a mere bridge to the next chapter of Half-Life, well, all those issues we've discussed don't seem quite so bad. Now, on the topic of that bundle, this brings us nicely to the next part of our story, because here we find an almighty crossroads, a release that would mark the end of Half-Life as we know it, and the start of a very new kind of Valve. It goes without saying that the most important release in Valve's history was their very first game, the sci-fi horror shooter that put them on the map and kick-started everything in this video. But if we had to pick a second most important game, I would not opt for Half-Life 2. Instead, my vote would go to the Orange Box, a bundle of 5 games sold in late 2007. And while this might not be Valve's most influential work, or their best-selling product, or even something that people are still playing today, it would prove to have an enormous impact on the future direction of the company. You see, the idea of producing smaller pieces of video game was not something exclusive to Half-Life, and while the episode expansions were in development, other teams inside of Valve were working on similar-sized projects. One of these had been coming for some time, a sequel to Team Fortress Classic, a very popular multiplayer class-based shooter that had come out alongside Half-Life 1. This could easily be an entire video in of itself, as Team Fortress 2 went through dozens of variations and revisions as the dev team really struggled to nail down a solid concept over the course of almost 10 years. But in 2006, they finally landed on something special. During playtesting, it finally twigged that a game this over-the-top and chaotic needed to look over-the-top and chaotic, which led to a shift in art style, embracing a more cartoony look and leaning into the inherent humour of the crazed red versus blue situation. It would prove to be an inspired decision, as the new art style allowed for super clear character silhouettes that made the complex gameplay much easier to understand. And along with this, it set up a legendary marketing campaign called Meet the Team, where Valve raked in millions upon millions of views every time they released a new class video. So while it might have been in development hell for most of the last decade, by 2007 there was a lot of hype around Valve's new multiplayer shooter, but this wasn't the only thing that people had to look forward to. Back in 2005, Valve director Robin Walker had been attending a showcase at the DigiPen Institute in Redmond, Washington, where he stumbled upon a group of game design students who had come up with something extremely interesting. They had built a game called Narbacular Drop, which revolved around solving puzzles by placing gateways that you could move between. A very novel concept that Walker loved so much, he convinced Gabe Newell to invite the team to Valve. This visit ended up going extremely well, and Gabe was so impressed that he offered them all jobs, which led to the start of a project called Portal. Again, just like with Team Fortress 2, this could easily be its own video, but the short version is that development on Portal went extremely well, as the combination of the source engine's polish, the ideas behind Narbacular Drop, and some very clever writing by Kim Swift and Eric Walpole ended up producing maybe the greatest puzzle game of all time. Now, the reason this is all relevant to our Half-Life investigation is that both Portal and Team Fortress 2 were on track to ship at the same time as Episode 2, which put Valve in a slightly awkward position, as they didn't want 3 separate releases all cannibalizing each other's sales. Thus, a bold decision was taken. Instead of selling these games separately, they would bundle them together and charge the same price that other companies would for a single new release. The idea was that raw value for money would do all of the marketing, but it actually got even better, as in early 2007, Valve announced that the bundle, now called the Orange Box, would include Half-Life 2 and Episode 1, and would be released not just through Steam, but on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. This was a very big deal, as those consoles were substantially more popular than the original Xbox, and thanks to their improved hardware, which could run Valve's blockbuster sequel without any compromises, the Orange Box transformed from a good deal into something unmissable. So obviously when it released in October of 2007, reviews were absolutely glorious. Journalists heaped glowing praise upon the genius design of Portal, gushed about the endless fun found in Team Fortress 2, and couldn't stop talking about the absurd value for money, all of which converted into big sales numbers, as the bundle shifted 4 million copies on console and a further 2 on PC in just a single year. This was a big contributing factor in that Half-Life 2 sales recovery we spoke about earlier, but there are some other interesting conclusions we can draw from this success, many of which shine a light on where Valve would go next. The first comes from those sales numbers, as they were substantially higher than those Half-Life Episode 1 had managed on its own, around 1.5 million units in its first 2 years. You might say that that's an unfair comparison, as it's a 3-hour expansion versus a 5-game bundle, but even if we divide the sales of the Orange Box by the amount of games included, the numbers are still a lot higher, and this proved that for all of Valve's talk about digital episodic publishing, a full-price physical box was still the most effective way to sell video games in the 2000s. Along with this, it's inarguable that it was Team Fortress 2 and Portal that were dominating all the headlines, a situation that was a little strange considering how much more effort had gone into Half-Life 2 Episode 2. You see, this second Half-Life 2 expansion had been in development for well over 2 years, and was being worked on by a pretty big team, as the developers responsible for Episode 1 had joined their colleagues on Episode 2 when their project had finished. By the time it was ready to ship, the final product was closer to a full sequel than a small add-on. But this came with big costs and required huge amounts of work, all of which was now being overshadowed by 2 games that were nowhere near as demanding to produce. This will be very important when we finally talk about Half-Life 2 Episode 3, but I also want to point out that there were shadows being cast from elsewhere in the industry. 2007 is often spoken about as one of the greatest years in video game history, and a large reason for this is that it saw the release of 3 of the finest first-person shooters ever created: Halo 3, Call of Duty 4, and BioShock, a trio of games that made Half-Life 2 feel just a little antiquated. Valve were no longer the only studio in the business that could make an attention-grabbing cinematic shooter, or first-person games with immersive and surprising narratives, or a multiplayer experience that kept people logging in night after night, as other companies had begun to catch up and in some ways even surpass them. To make matters even more tricky, the PC market was no different, as 2007 saw the release of the Burning Crusade, the much-anticipated first World of Warcraft expansion, and this supercharged Blizzard's MMO, transforming it into a global sensation, where over 8 million people logged in every single day, and importantly, played very little else. Along with the release of games like Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, Guitar Hero 3, Uncharted, and the Nintendo Wii, there was just so much happening that year, and amidst this huge swell of competition, the release of Episode 2 simply didn't feel as seismic as the monster hype that had surrounded Half-Life 1 and 2. It all meant that while Valve's new episode reviewed extremely well, landing an average score of 90 out of 100, it felt as if Half-Life had slipped from being a series that broke the industry every time a new game released, to something that you bought as part of a bundle. This is what many people forget when talking about that mythical unpublished Episode 3, because the circumstances that surrounded the Half-Life series and Valve's episodic experiment had already meaningfully changed long before Episode 2 had even released. But I think we might be getting ahead of ourselves, as before we start talking about that legendary dead end, we need to take a look at the last piece of this puzzle, a game that represents the very pinnacle of everything that is good about Half-Life 2. I think we'd better start this next chapter with something that has been looming over this entire video, that Half-Life 2 Episode 2 left this series on a gigantic cliffhanger, one that as of the writing of this script remains unresolved. While Valve would eventually return to the series many years later, it was not to pick up the story that they had left back in 2007, and despite endless online speculation about the return of Gordon Freeman, he is still very much trapped in limbo, the hero of a story that seems to have no conclusion. Now, this has become the defining characteristic of Episode 2, and for good reason, as it's almost unthinkable for a developer to move away from such a popular and well-respected franchise. But today, I want to focus on something slightly different, because the story of Half-Life is not the only thing that died with Episode 2. If you can believe it, this marks the last time that Valve would produce a piece of traditional AAA video game, something designed to tell a cinematic, single-player story, to push graphical boundaries, to appeal to a broad range of players and to compete against other games in the same genre. While they would continue to release incredible games, from Episode 2 onwards, the studio's output became much more experimental and much more focused on multiplayer. And it is this lost, single-player, cinematic shooter version of Valve that I want to mourn for. Now we're going to do this by looking at Episode 2 in two halves. One focused on all its new gameplay ideas, and a second that deals with its narrative. Because outside of the famous cliffhanger, Valve were doing some very interesting things before the curtain fell. So, let's start with the aesthetics and premise, which go hand in hand, as Episode 2 takes us out into the vast wilderness beyond City 17, a frontier of sprawling forests, labyrinthine cave systems and rugged cliffsides, all resting beneath a vast sky punctured by the remains of the Citadel. You see, at the end of Episode 1, Alex and Gordon's train was knocked off its rails by a portal storm, a kind of destructive pulse emitting from the Combine's ruined dark matter generator. Each one rips across the land, leaving devastation in its wake, but thankfully our heroes have a plan to stop this, as we soon discover that the Resistance, under the surly guidance of yet another Black Mesa veteran, Dr. Arne Magnusson, have built a satellite capable of closing down the Combine's portals for good. The only problem is that in order to do this, the science team needs a data packet that Alex stole during Episode 1. So, our job for the entirety of Episode 2 is a lengthy jaunt across the countryside in order to hand it over and save the world yet again. It is a simple but compelling objective, and a great excuse for Valve to take us out beyond the claustrophobic walls of City 17 and into spaces that blend the intricacy of Episode 1 with the base game's bold and varied level design. Now, before we get onto the glut of new ideas that have been crammed into this journey, I want to take a moment to appreciate just how good Valve had become at designing traditional Half-Life levels, as this had already taken a step up in Episode 1, but is even better in the sequel. There's a moment around halfway through the episode where Gordon needs to make his way down through a cliffside facility and over to a crumbling bridge, as Alex has spotted a car that they can use to speed up their travels. In raw mechanical terms, this whole sequence has absolutely nothing original in it. No new enemies, no new gameplay ideas, no new weapons, and it doesn't have a particularly original look. But where it excels is in its flow. You begin up at the top of the facility, able to look out over the rest of the level, a clever move that not only gives our descent a better sense of purpose, but also allows Alex to provide sniper fire from above. This means the encounters can have more enemies without losing the sense of Ravenholm-esque isolation, and in turn it allows Valve to mix things up, as depending on where you are in the level, Alex might not be able to see you, and thus you'll lose your covering fire. So after a little blast of platforming across radioactive runoff, and a sequence where we're trapped in a room surrounded by zombies, we find ourselves scaling the bridge, only to discover that the last portal storm has knocked it out of alignment, and thus we can't get the car back over to the other side. The solution is that tried and tested Half-Life 2 puzzle, the seesaw, but rather than this causing a groan of familiarity, it's got a novel twist thanks to its sheer scale. Once that's done, we climb in the car, rev it as hard as we can, and leap back to Alex and the facility, which in a lovely little piece of symmetrical level design is exactly where we started. Essentially, this level is Half-Life 2 at its most pure, a tight combination of first-person shooting and little moments of platforming and puzzle solving, all woven around a realistic environment that flows beautifully from point A to point B, and shows that after 3 rounds of development, Valve had become the masters of this kind of design. Now, this is the standard found all throughout Episode 2, but on top of nailing the basics, there are a few particularly cool moments where old ideas get brought back and reimagined, almost as if Valve wanted to prove that they could in fact work. The standout example is a sequence early on, where Alex has been injured, and we have to defend her from an onslaught of antlions, while she receives treatment from a helpful Vortigaunt. It is conceptually very similar to the wave defense sections in Nova Prospect, even giving us a handful of automated turrets to help beat back our attackers. But thanks to a few important changes, one of the original game's dullest moments has been transformed into something pretty engaging. Here, rather than enemies pouring in at set intervals through 1 or 2 entrances, we're surrounded by a series of tunnels that will light up, depending on how many antlions are going to attack. This is much more dynamic, as not only do you have to scramble to rearrange your defences depending on where the lights change, but you never have quite enough turrets and mines to cover the whole room. And this means that you're not just playing tower defence, but have to get stuck in yourself. Now, our reward for getting to the end is a fun little moment of gratifying power fantasy, as the healer Vortigaunt's companions arrive just in time for one last battle, where we get to see these quirky aliens in full flow, mowing down antlions with psychic power and feeling much more like the powerful beings that Valve had begun to present them as. Altogether, it makes for a great chunk of first-person shooter gameplay, full of funny voice lines and chaotic action, but this is not the only place where Valve have opted to iterate rather than innovate. As we've already discussed, Alex and Gordon eventually find themselves zipping across the wilderness in a car, which initially looks very similar to our jaunt up the coast in Highway 17. The thing is, Episode 2 gets a lot more creative, and rather than simply ferrying us from one location to the next, this car functions more like a combination of all of Valve's previous vehicular ideas and even has its own unique mechanic. In Thanks for Beating Back the Combine, one of the Resistance mechanics gives you a radar, and this allows us to detect hidden caches of ammo and weapons, all of which take us off the intended path and into little sections of optional gameplay, like unique puzzles or scripted chunks of combat. Now, it's not exactly open world, as you could easily stumble across most of these locations without the radars bleeping, but the mechanic does create a sense of player-driven exploration, something that normally isn't part of the Half-Life equation, which typically relies on funneling you directly from one exciting moment to the next. Along with voice lines from Alex that add colour and character to our discoveries, it's just a really great part of the game. And for years, I've always felt that this was where Half-Life might have gone next, embracing even larger environments and letting the player control how and where they explored. Sadly, we'll never know if these ideas were a one-off experiment or a sign of the future, but they show that Valve hadn't yet found the boundaries of what Half-Life could be, and that is a real shame considering this is as far as the series ever went. Now, along with these level design remixes, Episode 2 also has some fresh faces in its roster of enemies, something that was much needed after the relative familiarity of Episode 1. The first comes in the form of the Worker Antlions, a new pale antlion variant that spits highly damaging acid, and which we encounter when delving into a vast underground nest. Now, as fun as the floor is lava concept was in Highway 17, this really jazzes up the antlion fights, as you have to balance taking cover from acidic missiles while being cornered by the feral melee variants. And as the nest is quite a confusing area, full of flooded caverns, snaking pathways and precipitous drops, it can make for some very chaotic encounters that feel like a throwback to the alien combat in Half-Life 1. In fact, there is another nod to Valve's roots in the form of a reimagined antlion guard, an alpha breed that we fought a few times in the base game but was never really more than a bullet sponge that ran around in circles. Here it's been given a serious upgrade, and now rather than fighting one head-on, we're thrown into a short sequence where we have to run away and hide in various crevices and safe spots, all of which feel like a throwback to the Gargantua chase scenes in Half-Life 1, and help break up all the relentless antlion combat. Now, what I really love about this section is that when we first enter the nest, you'll soon realise that you can recover health by walking over the antlion's squishy, luminescent grubs. And thanks to them being absolutely everywhere, this allows us to keep Gordon topped up without Valve having to jam in anachronistic healing points. It's a nice little piece of naturalistic design, but here it comes with a funny little twist, as when we arrive at the Resistance hideout, we're told that traversing the nest is actually extremely safe, as long as you don't touch their grubs. It is a very funny moment, made all the better by Gordon's silence, which makes him sound extremely guilty, and even though it's not possible to make it through the nest without popping a single grub, it's this sort of black humour that makes the writing in Valve games so memorable, and which, if we're honest, was slightly lacking in the Half-Life 2 base game. Now, as welcome as all these new toxic insects are, they are not the main event, as this comes in lethal tripedal form, a hulking new Combine monster, the squawking synthetic hunters. These are drip-fed to us in fleeting glimpses and distant howls, eventually appearing on screen properly when they injure Alex, all of which builds to the first time we face them in combat, which itself only comes after our heroes attempt to hide in a blown-out way station. It's a pretty typical move for Valve to give us glimpses of an enemy before we fight them, as they do this all throughout Half-Life 2 with the Striders and Combine soldiers and gunships. But something about the way this works with the hunters feels particularly cinematic, like they've taken cues from Alien or Jurassic Park, and it means that when we eventually do get to fight back, it feels all the more satisfying. Now, actually taking one down is no mean feat, as they come equipped with armoured hides that shrug off most ammunition, a powerful charge if you step too close, and explosive flechettes that will tear through your health if you try to fight from range. As they can pursue you in and out of buildings, they ask a completely different tactical question to everything else in Half-Life 2, turning the combat into a sort of crazed game of cat and mouse, where you're constantly backpedaling, always checking for escape routes or desperately searching for something that you can use to slow down your pursuer. After a full game and a short expansion that pretty much exhausted the possibilities of headcrab zombies and Combine foot soldiers, the hunters are just what the series needed. And the fact that it comes in the form of such a weird and imposing alien, well, it manages to bring back some of that much needed enemy creativity. So if Episode 2 feels like the culmination of Valve's first-person shooter philosophy, it is more than fitting that it should end with one of the best pieces of level design in the company's history. A climactic finale that brings together the unique level concepts of Half-Life 2 and the raw cinematic action of their 1998 classic. It all begins when Alex and Gordon finally arrive at the White Forest Resistance base, and after we reunite with Eli and Kleiner, who we haven't seen in person, uncaptured since Black Mesa East, our heroes hand over the Combine data packet needed to close the portal storm. The only trouble is that a massive Combine force has tracked our heroes, and they are now bearing down on the satellite launch site, which needs to be defended until it is ready to go. Obviously, this job falls to the messianic liberator of humanity that we control, but unlike in City 17, there is a lot more to this fight than just firing endless amounts of rockets at Striders and gunships. Just before the Combine arrive, Dr. Magnuson introduces us to an interesting invention, the Magnuson device, a machine that can be attached to a Strider with the gravity gun and then shot to take it out in a single detonation. The idea is to use these to destroy the invading Combine forces, but we also need to track them down. So rather than fighting in a tight city block where the Striders come to us, we're let loose in a large forest valley, where we have to use the car's radar to intercept our enemies before they reach the satellite. In many ways, it's conceptually quite similar to the antlion wave defense earlier in the episode, but here the scale is on a whole nother level, as there are buildings that explode in glorious showers of debris, packs of hunters doing battle with resistance fighters, and the constant roar of your car as you race between different fronts. It is truly Half-Life 2 at its very best, an endlessly replayable, visually engrossing, hyper-exciting combat sandbox, where unpredictable physics and quick decision-making matter just as much as good aim. I think this is what makes me truly pine for that sequel that never was, because Valve had such a unique style that we just don't really see anymore, and in many ways, Episode 2 feels even fresher today than it did back in 2007. Despite being best known for making games where you shoot things, this wasn't really ever the point of Valve's work, which was to showcase all the cool things you could do when visionary engineers and level designers worked together, and just how exciting first-person games could be when the player was in full control. This is the hidden tragedy behind Valve moving on from Half-Life, because not only did we lose the chance to see Gordon Freeman finally defeat the Combine, but we also lost all those undesigned mechanics and innovative gameplay ideas that might have come along with it. Now obviously there is only so much conversation you can have about Half-Life 2, Episode 2, before you have to start talking about its notoriously unfinished story. But here, I want to point out yet again that this expansion is really much more than just a cliffhanger. In many ways, it feels like an attempt to address all the narrative missteps that we saw in the final few hours of Half-Life 2, and prove that Valve's commitment to first-person immersion mixed with cinematic drama could actually work. Now, we've already seen some of this in action, as the episode opens with the horrifying visual of Alex being skewered by a hunter, a clever narrative moment as Valve builds tension while you're in control, and then takes it away for just enough time to deliver the shocking attack. Sure, it's not that pure commitment to player immersion that made Half-Life 1 so groundbreaking, but it inarguably makes for more compelling stories, and it is in 2 more instances just like this that we find Episode 2's big ideas. The first comes after we have conquered the antlion nest and returned to the Vortigaunts armed with the lava that they can use to bring Alex back from the brink, a process that seems to take all their psychic concentration and creates this hypnotizing X-ray effect on her lifeless body. It is purposefully transfixing, as you are being set up for an almighty surprise, as just like at the peak of the Citadel, everything suddenly freezes as a terrible, quivering voice rings out from the void, calling Dr. Freeman for a heart-to-heart. It is of course the G-Man, and as he projects himself into our mind's eye, he tells us that he had to wait until our alien friends were occupied to get back in touch. But instead of coming with threats and riddles, this time he is strangely forthcoming. We learn that he saved Alex from the destruction of Black Mesa as a child, confident that she would grow to become someone he could use, and now, in exchange for saving Gordon's life twice over, he requests that we make sure she reaches the Resistance base, where she will whisper to her father, "Prepare for unforeseen consequences." It is, as ever, cryptic and mysterious, but I find this to be so much better than the G-Man's appearance at the end of Half-Life 2, as it replicates the sudden shock of his Half-Life 1 appearance without having to kill the narrative in its track, and adds details to the mythos that players might actually theorize about. What does he want with Alex? What does he want with Eli? Why did he trigger the resonance cascade, and why is he continuing to thwart the Combine? The fact that all of this arrives smack bang in the middle of Episode 2 is just a brilliant decision, the perfect reward for our efforts so far, and a heavy dose of motivation to push on and discover what might happen next. It shows just how far Valve had come as storytellers since their slightly uneasy first steps in 2004, but things only get better from here, as after Alex is healed and our protagonists resume their journey, we are thrust face to face with the alien heart of the Combine. This happens during a pit stop that takes us into an abandoned Resistance outpost, where the air seems to shimmer as we move deeper into the building. In its central room, we discover the Source, a mechanical cocoon housing a Combine advisor, one of the faceless alien grubs that we catch fleeting glimpses of during Half-Life 2 and Episode 1. It is heavily implied that they are the brains behind the Combine Empire, but as we only ever see their human thralls, it's hard to know what they actually are. But Alex is sure that whatever lies inside of that pod, it has to be destroyed. So you pull out your gravity gun and disconnect the power, but rather than killing the monster, this only wakes it up. And as Alex and Gordon are flung backwards by its intense psychic pressure, we watch on in horror as it lifts a nearby corpse and feasts on its brain. Next up is Gordon, and we get this incredible shot of the advisor's tentacle reaching out towards the screen, almost begging to be rendered in disgusting VR. But thankfully we are saved by its cocoon exploding, hurting the freakish creature and causing it to retreat in a swirl of broken wood and metal. The scene is as immediately exciting as the Half-Life series ever gets, but what I truly love about this section is that it feels like a return to the gory sci-fi horror of Half-Life 1, where humans are mere food for unknowable alien horrors from the depths of outer space. it is totally at odds with the grounded tone of our time in City 17, and likely only exists because Viktor Antonov had left the company. But I think it really suits this series, as Valve were far too good at crafting grotesque monsters to abandon this style forever. Alas, it is yet another reason to lament the dead end that this episode represents, because while we do get to see the advisors one more time, this scene feels as if it reopened a door that Valve would never actually step through. Now, before we talk about that aforementioned cliffhanger, let's take a quick look at what happens when Alex and Gordon arrive at the White Forest base, because here we get a very interesting dose of world building that felt like a very big deal at the time. You see, after our emotional reunion with Eli and Kleiner, and some muted praise from Dr. Magnuson, our heroes gather to watch a transmission from Judith Mossman, who is away in the Arctic investigating something called the Borealis. This appears to be a large icebreaker, but what is truly notable is the name of the company who built it, Aperture Science, a long-standing rival to Black Mesa and the Crazed Fools responsible for the portal gun. It might not sound like much in 2026, but at the time, it was a huge revelation to discover that Portal and Half-Life took place in the same universe, and it set the internet ablaze with theories about how the two series might intertwine in future sequels. Now, ironically, neither of the lead writers of either set of games were all that hot on this idea, and it's since been rowed back to more of a fun little Easter egg rather than a full-blown Valve expanded universe. But it's still interesting to look back at a time when Valve had big franchise ambitions and were actively setting things up for fans to get excited about. So on that note, I think we better talk about the elephant in the room, Episode 2's cliffhanger ending, because it is impossible to theorise about where Half-Life might have gone next without looking at where it is currently trapped. Episode 2 ends with a tone of triumphant victory, as after Gordon beats back the invading forces of the Combine, we get to watch the satellite launch into orbit, tearing through the sky in a glorious plume of smoke and fire. It's such a hard-fought moment that our cast decides to step outside and really soak it in, and as the portal storm collapses in on itself and we hear the cheers of joy from characters that we have now spent almost 20 hours with, it's hard not to feel some of that emotion bleeding out of the screen. So with the Earth now safe, all that remains is the Arctic hunt for the Borealis. But just before Alex and Gordon can board their chopper, one last twist bursts in through the window. A pair of Combine advisors who pin Gordon and Alex to the wall and kill Dr. Eli Vance. It is a surprisingly brutal scene, not because of the visuals, but because of the performances, as Alex begs the alien monsters to stop, while Eli pleads for her to not watch. And while the Combine ghouls are eventually driven off by Dog, the final shot of Alex crying over her father's lifeless body is a gut punch like nothing else in this series. Again, just like the mid-game intervention of the G-Man and our first encounter with the advisors, it proves that Valve had finally mastered this unique style of cinematic first-person storytelling, and it is this, rather than the unconcluded story, that keeps me awake at night when thinking about those games that we never got. Along with all of its clever gameplay innovations and the sheer polish with which Valve had pieced it together, Episode 2 is so much more than just a middle child, accidentally thrust into the spotlight, as I really believe this is one of the best things that this legendary studio have ever made. It's effectively the culmination of all of that ambition that we discussed back in 2004. A first-person game full of creative gameplay, grafted onto an emotional story. One that feels massive in scope while never losing track of its identity as a video game. It clearly goes without saying, but it still needs to be said anyway. It is a tragedy that Valve never produced the sequel that this game deserves, and I am very confident that had they remained on this trajectory, it would have been a very special experience indeed. So while this takes us to the end of the Half-Life 2 saga, there is one small epilogue that we need to touch on, Because while details about that unmade episode 3 remained a mystery for a great many years, in 2026 we actually have quite a lot of information about how it might have looked. The lion's share of this came in 2017, when Mark Laidlaw left Valve and published an article called Episode 3 to his personal blog, a short sci-fi story that was obviously intended to be a gender-swapped outline of Half-Life 2 Episode 3. Now, Laidlaw has since said that he regrets posting this, and various other Valve employees have stated that Episode 3 was never officially agreed upon as the direction for the sequel, but it's very hard to take these claims seriously as it all sounds so very plausible. In this proto-Episode 3, Gordon and Alex would indeed travel to the Arctic in order to find the Borealis, where they would discover that Aperture had transformed it into a huge portal device, one which the Combine were now trying to claim in order to reconquer Earth. Now that's a fairly obvious direction of travel considering what we know from Portal and Episode 2, but what is far more shocking is that in Laidlaw's version of Episode 3, Alex became a much darker character, spurred on by the death of her father to get revenge at all costs, killing a confused Wallace Breen who'd been resurrected as a Combine advisor, and even slaying Judith Mossman after they disagree about what to do with the ship. Given she's the human heart of the Half-Life series, it's a brave direction to go in, and one that would have ended with our heroes turning the Borealis into an interdimensional bomb, only to be interrupted at the moment of impact by the ever-punctual G-Man. What's interesting is that here, rather than abducting Gordon, he has come for Alex. And Epistle 3 ends with Dr. Freeman watching in horror as his friend chooses to leave him, stepping beyond the veil to serve his nemesis, and setting the stage for the series to go off in any possible direction. Despite their protestations, this is all completely believable as a conclusion to the wider Half-Life 2 narrative, and as if we needed any more evidence, in November of 2024, Valve released an anniversary documentary that effectively confirmed it. While there isn't any mention of Episode 3's potential story, the documentary does contain previously unseen footage of scrapped mechanics and gameplay ideas, all of which seem to be taking place in the frigid wastes of the Arctic. If the finer details of Laidlaw's Epistle 3 weren't entirely locked in, the general direction certainly was. And while we'll never know exactly how it might have turned out, I am certain that the war between humanity and the Combine would have ended in a blizzard of freezing snow and a large teleporting ship. As for the rest, well, given where Valve would eventually take this series, I'll leave that up to you to ponder. But let's just say that the idea of the G-Man making Alex an offer that she cannot refuse is one narrative thread not so easily left behind. So with that, we arrive at those questions that have been hanging over this entire video. The shadows that have followed Valve around since they left Gordon and Alex laying on that hangar floor. Why did they abandon Half-Life? And why didn't they make Episode 3? What could have caused them to move on from the series that had originally put them on the map? Well, for years we simply had no answers, as Valve were extremely tight-lipped about their internal operations. But in recent years, we've been allowed more insight, and there now are explanations out in the wild. According to Gabe Newell himself, speaking in both Valve-produced documentaries and various interviews, the thinking behind such an odd move is rooted in those same lofty ambitions that we spoke about back in 2004. To him, Half-Life had always been about pushing boundaries and doing things that nobody else could. And in the aftermath of Episode 2, despite having an outline of where Episode 3 might be headed, the studio just couldn't think of a way to make it feel special. Yes, they could have just concluded the story and produced another high-quality shooter, but to Newell, this sounded too ordinary. And as none of the prototypes or proposals ever met his high bar, Episode 3 ended up never being made. This is what I'm going to call the orthodox explanation. the argument that you'll typically hear whenever this subject comes up, and it is popular for good reason, as it not only comes straight from the horse's mouth, but it seems to line up with how Valve do business. You see, thanks to their lack of demanding shareholders, the incredible popularity of Steam, and a handful of ludicrously profitable live service games, Valve have become a company that doesn't actually need to produce games in order to make eye-watering amounts of money, and because of this, their developers have a pretty unique way of working. Rather than the endless cycle of churning out high-profile sequels, they are instead given the freedom to explore strange ideas, to shift around between projects and abandon things that aren't working. A very strange philosophy, but one that embraces the creativity in video game production and technical research. With any other developer or publisher, it would be unthinkable for them to ditch their flagship franchise simply because they didn't find it fun to make. But with Valve, a company that has jumped around between shooters, storefronts, MOBAs, controllers, VR equipment, and even a handheld device, well, it actually sounds completely on brand. Now, the ironic thing is that while this way of working effectively killed Episode 3, it did eventually lead to another Half-Life game in 2020, although it was nothing like anyone could have predicted back in 2007. This was, of course, Half-Life Alyx, a prequel set 5 years before Half-Life 2, which stars the titular Alyx Vance as she attempts to fight back against the Combine's occupation, all presented in gloriously interactive virtual reality. Now, that might fool you into thinking that Half-Life had always been close to returning, but actually, Alyx began life as more of a generic VR experiment, put together out of Half-Life 2 assets for no greater reason than that Valve already had them. Luckily for long-starved fans, the dev team eventually realised that this pairing made a lot of sense, and as a new Half-Life game would obviously generate a lot of headlines and excitement, it made sense to push ahead with a prequel. The result was an incredible experience, one that blends Valve's keen eye for first-person gameplay and detailed environments with the immersion inherent in VR. But in a cruel twist of fate, this also proved to be a hard ceiling on its success. Despite a glorious critical reception, Half-Life Alyx wasn't exactly the trigger for a global VR frenzy, and amidst reports of just a couple of million units sold after almost 5 years on the market, it doesn't exactly feel like Alyx was the long-awaited series resurrection that fans had been dreaming of. Now, the reason I am bringing this up is that this game's existence would seem to back up the way that Gabe speaks about Half-Life, and that orthodox explanation for the lack of an Episode 3. He has explained many times that Valve only made Alyx because it presented them with an opportunity to do something interesting, embracing new technologies just like they had back in 2004, which has given rise to the theory that Half-Life 3 will only be made if they have something truly mind-blowing to work with. We could end the video here, with a cyberpunk dream of Gordon Freeman's next adventure. But my friends, I cannot shake the feeling that this is not the full picture. You see, I don't think the timelines in this explanation really make any sense, and I have become convinced that while Gabe is telling the truth about Valve's attitude towards Half-Life in 2026, this requirement for innovation cannot be the sole reason that Episode 3 was scrapped. So indulge me as I lay out an alternative explanation, one that begins in the aftermath of the Orange Box's release and involves a slightly more cynical view of Valve's motivations. At this time, Gabe Newell was still telling journalists that their next big project was Half-Life 2 Episode 3, but alongside this, they were also working on an innovative multiplayer shooter called Left 4 Dead. This had begun life much like Portal, with a small team of developers working towards a very focused objective: the idea of an asymmetrical multiplayer shooter set in a zombie apocalypse. The result was a simple but addictive game, where you either played as a human survivor or as a special infected, and thanks to its clever blend of cooperative and competitive gameplay, it was a monster hit. After less than 12 months on the market, Valve announced that Left 4 Dead had sold 3 million copies, which led to the immediate creation of a sequel, which was released a year later and returned similarly massive sales numbers. Now, what is notable about this is that the Left 4 Dead games had cost a fraction of what Valve had spent to create Half-Life 2 and its episodes. Not only because they were much more narrow in their scope, but because producing them literally required less time and manpower. Along with the success of Portal 2, another award-winning iterative sequel that released in 2011 and was also produced by a relatively small team, this era marked the start of Valve's shift away from traditional AAA development, as there was simply no need to spend massive amounts of money in order to make massive amounts of money. Now, the cruel irony here is that this is exactly what had prompted Valve to pivot Half-Life towards an episodic format. But the reality was that this just didn't work with a series as big and bold as Half-Life. This was a family of games built on groundbreaking technology, big narrative ideas, eye-catching set pieces, and creative gameplay systems, all things that take a huge amount of effort to put together, and as Valve learnt when they released Half-Life 2 and Episode 1, don't automatically result in the sort of sales numbers that Gabe wanted to be seeing. So given that Steam was also gaining momentum during this period, it's not really that surprising that Episode 3 never progressed into full development. And while there is no evidence or testimony to support this, I can fully believe that Gabe cancelled the project when it became clear that it would take a massive game to conclude the series. The reality was that while they had a legion of devoted fans desperate to find out what would happen to Gordon and Alex, when compared to their other, smaller projects, another Half-Life game simply didn't make financial sense. Now, this might sound like quite a cynical theory, one that lacks the poetic tragedy of a studio struggling to find the magic, but I think there is quite a lot of evidence to support this read, as in the aftermath of their episodic experiment, Valve transformed into a very different kind of company. By 2015, the legendary series that had made them a household name, Half-Life, Left 4 Dead, Portal, these had all disappeared behind the enormity of Dota 2 and Counter-Strike, two monster live service games that boasted millions of daily players and microtransaction revenue that was measured in the billions. Now, you might imagine that this would afford the developers at Valve even greater freedom to pursue their creative whims, but that doesn't seem to be the case, as Valve haven't released a single non-multiplayer, non-VR game in over 15 years. In fact, you can hear this shift in the way that ex-Valve employees talk about the company, like Eric Walpole, Josh Wire, and even Mark Laidlaw, who have all in unrelated interviews made jokes and wry comments about how Gabe would never agree to make Portal 3 or Left 4 Dead 3 because they wouldn't make Counter-Strike money. The horrible truth is that even if Valve did miraculously decide to make Half-Life 3, and even if it was an unprecedented success and sold 30 million copies in its first year, this would still come nowhere near what they are already making with a mere fraction of the effort. Considering we have just spent almost 3 hours talking about a studio that once clearly loved storytelling, world building, and immersive single player design, it is unbearably sad to see what they have become. A company now focused on experimental tech, a couple of live service cash cows, and a ludicrously profitable storefront. They are a business that makes billions and billions of dollars in the video game industry, but one that no longer has any interest in producing video games. This is why I am so confident that there will never be an idea revolutionary enough to convince Gabe Newell to return to Half-Life. Because if we are totally honest, its lengthy and seemingly impossible absence is just as much about a lack of potential profit as it is a lack of creativity. Now, maybe you don't find this to be a convincing argument, and maybe in a few years' time we'll all be sitting with our jaws wide open, staring at our screens during some grand announcement, as a crowbar is raised into view and a familiar hero bursts back to life. I would happily welcome that moment, but I don't think it will ever happen. So the next time the internet explodes in a flurry of rumour and speculation, or someone tells you that Valve will surely bring Gordon back alongside some new piece of hardware, just remember that while video game sequels are normally inevitable, Half-Life is anything but normal. Thanks for watching. As ever, this video comes courtesy of the support of my patrons, who I owe a big thanks to, as you might have noticed that this video took quite a bit longer to produce than I had originally intended. Thanks to a combination of creative burnout, some serious family health issues, and a nightmare trip to Greece, all of which I will regale you with in the upcoming post-video stream, the production of this Half-Life 2 video turned into a pretty wild parallel of the game's own development. So if you signed up or kept your pledge during these past 3 months, you have my undying gratitude, and I promise that the next Patreon exclusive will be an absolute doozy in order to make up for the wait. Now, in slightly more positive news, you might have noticed that the historical chapters of this video had a slightly different editing style, and that comes courtesy of the channel's new editor, Liam, who's going to be helping me with production moving forwards. I really think that his eye for archived footage, magazine scans, and all the little in-game shots make those chapters so much more engaging. So make sure you show him some love in the comments, as I'm really excited about what he could bring to the next few videos. As for what they're going to be, well, I'll keep that to myself for now. But if you'd like to pester me for clues, you can catch me in the I Finished a Video Game Discord or over on Twitch, where, as is now tradition, I am reviving the ill-fated weekly stream in a bout of foolish post-release positivity. If you're interested in either, the links are down in the description below, along with the code for 50% off of the Patreon. Otherwise, thanks for watching, thanks for supporting, and I'll see you on the next one.